members, we're going to go ahead and get started. That is the call to order. Okay. Next item is roll call.
Dr. Opie. Present. Mr. Castile.
Here.
Dr. Davis. Here. Ms. Ellis is not in attendance. Mr. Garvey.
Here.
Ms. Holloway. Here. Mr. Mellering is not in attendance. Mr. Morris.
Here.
Ms. Orange-Jones is not in attendance. Mr. Rock.
Here.
Ms. Fauché. Here. You have a quorum.
Okay, next item, please.
Next item is approval of the agenda.
Can we get a motion to approve the agenda, please?
So moved.
Ms. Bopey, seconded by Ms. Davis. Any objections to the motion? Hearing none, the motion carries. Next item.
Next item, consideration of a discussion regarding revisions to policy related to the 2025 high school assessment substitutions due to COVID-19 as it pertains to graduation requirements for 2021-2022.
So moved.
To motion to
Consider the discussion.
Seconded by Ms. Davis. Motion by Ms. Bopey. Dr. Bopey, seconded by Dr. Davis. Does anybody want to take the floor and discuss this, Dr. Bopey?
Well, I want to start by thanking my fellow board members for the opportunity to have this conversation. You all know that I have the opportunity to serve as a principal now, and through that role, am able to appreciate some of the details of this situation that I don't think I could appreciate if I wouldn't be in that role. And so I know this is a conversation that we need to have. I'm looking forward to having that conversation. I think there's some really key things, board members, for you to take away from this is to truly understand what all of our graduation requirements are, and have an appreciation for what those graduation requirements are. To look at the class of 2022, I think they're a special class. I think when you compare them to some of the previous classes, for instance, the class of 2019, which was a pre-pandemic class, that you can see some clear differences. This is a group of students who, as sophomores, their schools were closed abruptly in March of their sophomore year. So their instruction was interrupted, and also their opportunity to test in the year that they received instruction on some really important tests for graduation. So in our state, in order to graduate, students have to pass either Algebra 1 or Geometry, English 1 or English 2, U.S. History, or Biology. And so when students were sophomores of that year, if they were taking Biology or U.S. History, and every school is different, every district is different. We had some students who were taking U.S. History and Biology that year. Those students who were part of the class of 2022 did not have to take that test, did not have to meet that graduation requirement. Yet some of their peers, who I believe should be sitting by them at graduation, are being held to those graduation requirements. And so I want us to have an appreciation for that, to truly understand, because I think we're holding some students to requirements that we're not holding other students to. And I struggle when that falls on the kid level. The last couple of years have been difficult for all of us. None of us signed up to be board members during the pandemic. Our superintendent, the timing for you, I think, was just as complicated as anybody else. But our students didn't choose that for their high school experience, yet that's what they've had. So they had that's what the experience was as sophomores. And like I said, if they took U.S. History and Biology their sophomore year, which there are examples of students who did, they don't have to meet this particular graduation requirement that we're holding other students to. I think in addition to understanding all of the graduation requirements, I think it's also important to just reflect on why we have graduation requirements to begin with. And I really appreciated having conversations over the last week or so about what our graduation requirements, why they exist. So I absolutely believe in them. You all know how passionate I am about education. And I'm also passionate about excellence, and I want excellence for all of our students. And our graduation requirements is one approach to get us to excellence. I would say that it's not exactly where we want it to be, but I think it's moving us in that direction. But ultimately, we have graduation requirements so that we can communicate to the public that our diplomas are meaningful. And we have graduation requirements so that when our students walk out of our high schools, they are prepared to be contributing citizens. And what brought this to the forefront for me is that I have a student who is ready to contribute to society. She's actually graduating with a collegiate technical diploma from SLCC. So she has all the credits she needs to graduate. The question I don't have the answer to, and you won't be answering that for me, I have to go to other people to find out, is whether or not the fact that she hasn't passed this LEAP test, therefore she hasn't met these graduation requirements, therefore she will not get a high school diploma, if she's still able to get the technical diploma. So it's really hard for me to explain to a student or to explain to parents how they've contributed so much and she's come so far, has a credential that's a multi-step credential, requires 400 hours in her field, 3 different standardized tests to achieve, and she's achieved those things. So I have a student who is ready to be a contributing citizen. Some people like to call them taxpayers. I have a student who's ready to be a contributing citizen, but unless she has a piece of paper that says she has a high school diploma, the doors for her to be a contributing citizen are shut. Those doors are not open to her. And so when I then look at someone who she would be sitting on the graduation stage with and see that that student didn't have to pass the U.S. history or the biology because she was so lucky to take U.S. history and biology her sophomore year and isn't being held to those standards, gets to walk at graduation. So again, thank you for being here for this meeting, because I couldn't make sense and reconcile those things myself with the family and the students. I think we have an issue. I will admit to you, I've known that this was an issue for a long time. There are people in the audience who will testify to that, but I put them off because honestly, I wanted everyone to leave everything on the table in serving our kids this year. And when we have graduation requirements, it forces people to do things like provide extra instruction, to provide tutoring, to get the most effective teachers possible to these students. And so I didn't want to have this conversation last August. I didn't want to have it in October or December. And unfortunately, the timing's just bad. Because now, and the results did not start coming back until after our April meeting. So now we know where people are. I'm hopeful that we have people in the audience who can talk about other districts. I know mine pretty well, but I want to hear what's going on in other districts because I think we have potential taxpayers in other districts who need a sheet of paper to open up that door for them. Because our communities need workers across the board. They don't need test takers, they need workers. And I have students, and I'm almost sure other districts do as well, that are ready to start working this month after graduation. So I'm hopeful that as a board, we can figure out a solution for an issue that students are not responsible for. And I really believe we can. I believe we can get to a good place. I think we've seen some examples of what's happened before with situations in other districts and even some solutions that we have put in place. And if those aren't enough, then I'm interested in talking through what else we might do. But what I can't do is look these kids in the eye and tell them, we'd rather you take a LEAP test than go to work.
Mr. Castillo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To me, it's sort of two issues. On one hand, I really strongly believe in our accountability system. And I think it's important that we have standards. I think it's important that we gather data. I think it's important to be able to figure out how schools perform and reacted to all sorts of circumstances, hurricanes, the pandemic, and any number of issues that occurred across the state over not only last year, but the last couple of years. So on one hand, I feel pretty strongly about the argument of, well, wait a minute, schools have had time to react. They've had money, they've had resources to react and make certain adjustments. And so I do think it's incredibly important that we as a state be able to track those results. So if a school or a district or us as a state have somehow failed in some way to help a child progress in a certain manner, I think it's very instructive for us to know that information, know that data, learn from it, and attempt to improve. Now, all of you know that I represent a pretty diverse district of 14 parishes across Louisiana, and they look different, and they've got different challenges, and I've heard from many people and many superintendents who have different opinions. Some of them are greatly different, some of them are sort of in the middle, and what I'm hearing is that, look, we've worked as hard as we could, and sometimes we've fallen short. And it's the adults that may have fallen short sometimes. Sometimes it's the student. But sometimes it's the adult. And so what concerns me on one hand is, you know, my very good friends who speak to me and we talk about accountability and having standards and pushing ourselves so that we can be as good as we possibly can as a state, which I think is incredibly important. But then I'm also trying to balance the very human issue of, we're talking about real kids, real students, that may have been impacted, not necessarily because they necessarily fell short alone, but a school may not have done what it's supposed to, or couldn't have. I don't know. But I hear on one hand the challenge of what we may or may not have been able to accomplish as either a school or a school district or a system. But if circumstances were different, the kids had taken the LEAP test and certain subjects in the 10th grade, that it might have worked out differently. And you've got that disparity and disparate outcomes that we have to address. So I'm really interested in the conversation, because what is the balance? Is the balance perhaps that we offer some sort of waiver or adjustment for students that may have been adversely impacted, that maybe they could not have controlled that outcome, and keeping in mind the real impact on the real child that's going to be impacted by all this. And balancing that with, we want to be able to have those standards. We want to be able to know the data is accurate, that we can take the results from, say, graduation and say, look, we know that this school would not have had this SPS score or this grade but for any adjustments that we may have made. That we need to know that data. I would like to know that information. And so how do we find that, if there is a middle ground to all that, how do we do it? So I want to thank Dr. Volpe for bringing this conversation up. I know it's terrible timing because graduation is around the corner. But from hearing from my constituents and stakeholders from across the state, it's an important conversation, notwithstanding that it's inconvenient in terms of timing. But it's an important conversation, because if there's one child that we can help that somehow we may have failed as an adult, it's important that we spend the time and try to get it right. Not because of everybody, but maybe just because of that one child that makes it all work. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Superintendent, do we have a presentation from the department?
We don't have a presentation, but we're prepared to provide information in terms of the numbers of students who are seniors who are not meeting graduation requirements due to a test. Comparison for the last few years, we have information on the number of students who are still in the queue to test and/or are awaiting results. So we have information to share. We're happy to do that.
Okay, I would imagine that the desk members would like to get that information. Yes, Mr. Morrison?
Yeah, thank you. I just had a couple of
Mike.
comments. It's great. Do better now.
Let me check.
How about that? Is that any different? What was that?
It's
It's
coming.
the technical difficulty of the technician.
Okay, try now.
How about now? We're good?
Yes.
Awesome, thank you, sir. Thank you, Steve. So I just had a couple of comments I wanted to share before we get started with the public comment. First of all, echo Mr. Castillo's comments. Really appreciate Dr. Bopey initiating this conversation. I think it's an important conversation. I think the board needs to provide a clear and transparent policy for high school graduation so that students, parents, administrators, everyone understands, what the expectations are. So I think it's prudent that we have this meeting. Just a couple of notes here, things that I hope to get out of this conversation. So hopefully folks come to the table and might get some consideration for things that I'm looking for. Number one is the schools that were successful, and they're not addressing this issue, what do they do differently? I'd like to understand what they did that other schools didn't do. And the schools that didn't implement these same things is what put them in this position. So I'd like to understand what the difference is. Second thing is clarification on the 2020 waiver relative to graduation requirements. I've heard two different conversations and it's just not clear to me yet. The waiver that was granted in 2020, if that satisfies the graduation requirement does the waiver satisfy the graduation requirement for students that were enrolled in the biology or the history class for that year? That's not clear in my mind yet, if it satisfies the graduation requirements or if the waiver just gives the student credit for taking the class. So I'm looking for clarification on that one. Then following up on Dr. Bovey's comments about disparity in graduation requirements for students of the same cohort. I'd like to get a better understanding for that. If we're going to have multiple standards for students in the same cohort, I'd like to better understand that. And then the next one I have, just a couple more. The next one I have is, the reality of the situation is every child in the class is not going to graduate. Okay, we don't get 100% graduation rate. So regardless if we're here today having this conversation or not, that's a fact. My question is, for those students who don't graduate this year, whether it be for traditional reasons or whatever this board might decide, what is the next step for that student? I think it's the high set option, would be the high school equivalent. So I'd like to better understand, what that pathway would look like for the affected students. What's required, how long does it take? What's the difference between that and the high school diploma as far as being a taxpayer that Dr. Bopey mentioned? Superintendent Brumman's already mentioned they've got the data for the populations in question. Last question I have is the specific drivers for the waiver. So this board hears requests for waivers on unfortunately, a routine basis for not providing foreign languages. What's the driver? Well, we don't have enough French teachers. I get it, right? But I'd like to get a better understanding for what the driver is for this waiver. Were there resources that were not made available to certain students? Was it extenuating circumstance ABC? I'd like to get a better understanding of what those extenuating circumstances are and keep in mind that we're considering a statewide waiver. Thank you, Mr. President.
Okay, Mr. Lambert, did you capture all of those?
I think so.
I'm just joking. I'm sure Mr. Morris will be happy to repeat them as we go through the presentation. Yeah, Ms. Holloway.
Yeah, are we good with questions being asked? Because I have questions.
Oh, I would think so.
Yeah.
I would think so. I would think as we go, because this is involving so many different points and aspects, I would think asking questions during the presentation and not at the end would probably be more appropriate. Unless someone, like the superintendent, thinks otherwise.
That sounds good.
Okay, thank you.
Before Mr. Lambert goes, I mean, we are in a very important conversation, no doubt, but I also want to recognize the fact that Teacher Appreciation and our teachers across the state the last few years have gone above and beyond, just like students and leaders and parents and community members. And so it's indirectly germane to this conversation. And certainly I want to acknowledge the teachers across the state of Louisiana. And I've also acknowledged that, like, this is hard every year. Like, I have been a school principal, and I've had these parents in my office and these kids in my office before that have gotten so close, but they just didn't make it. And oftentimes, and I know Superintendent Bochet would probably echo this, oftentimes it's you're waiting on a result the day of the graduation potentially, and then the worst is when that result doesn't come back the way you want it, and you have families in, and it's a really challenge. I've sat in the seat as the superintendent where they appeal to you at the superintendent level to please just let my kid walk across the stage, please let them participate. Why have you not done enough to ensure that my kid passed the test? So this has been hard for a long time, and I understand it's a different set of conditions over the last couple of years, but it has been difficult for a long time, and kids haven't always made the mark. But a couple of comments before we get started, just some information. In 2019, 4% of students did not graduate as a result of not having one of their EOCs completed and passed successfully. In 21, that number was 6%. In 22, and we stayed up, we were on the phone through the night, trying to get as clean a data as possible. That number is 7%. As of this morning, to the best of our knowledge, but we do think that number is likely to decrease. That percentage is likely to decrease for a couple of reasons. One, we still have cleanup. Two, there could be some Act 833 considerations that could impact that. And also, we still have students that are in the queue either waiting to test or waiting on results to test. And so, Dr. Bofi mentioned biology and American history, and that is essentially the set of courses the majority of the students are falling into in this particular situation. And as of now, we know that we have 1,000 kids who are either waiting to test or waiting on results for U.S. history, and essentially 1,000 for biology as well. So we do anticipate, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Lambert, but we do anticipate that 7% to likely decrease. And so I think I've captured a few of your questions, Mr. Moore. I'll turn it over to Mr. Lambert for the rest.
I think that you captured most of the data that I was going to share, actually. The actual number of seniors for 2022 that would fall into this category is about 2,400. We expect that number would go down. As Dr. Brumley said, there are about 1,000 seniors that are currently in the queue to take the EOC for U.S. history, and another 1,000 for the biology exam. So we expect that if there's a 20 or 30% retest pass rate, that we would be well within the normal range for the percent of students that met the graduation requirement for assessments. Some of these data are kind of difficult to really model with a great degree of precision because the waivers required us to know certain things about what courses students were enrolled in during the spring of the pandemic. Transcript data for underclassmen is not reported with a lot of fidelity. So as a result, we're kind of waiting until their senior year to see that final transcript. So that could also impact these numbers, but we'd expect to impact in the downward direction and not the upward direction.
Ms. Bowden, Dr. Bowden.
So of the 2,400 how many of those are the US history, biology combination versus maybe the English or the math, or English and math together?
The vast majority are.
But like,
I don't have
are
the
we
exact
talking
number.
like 2,200, or are we talking like, I mean, because the majority would be more than 50%, so
Yeah,
am I like getting closer to 90?
I would say it's probably closer to 60% of them.
Okay, closer to 60%, okay. Now, I think one piece that's important for people to appreciate is that this state is not committed to the US history test in the long run. Could you tell the board more about that?
Yeah, so the department brought, can you all still hear me?
No, I think you're off.
Can you all hear me now? I just want to pop in. The US history exam will be phased out over time and replaced with a civics exam aligned to the new social studies state standards. So in the long run, the social studies assessment will switch to civics. So future cohorts will take the civics exam, not the US history exam.
Give me more specifics about what the long run means.
3, cohort coming soon. We haven't announced the exact cohort that this will happen for. The exam will switch from US history to civics.
But we don't know what date that is.
That's
We just haven't
That's
announced that
not
date. Okay. Talk to me more about the difference between pass rates on US history versus pass rates on biology. And board members, I ask this question because it's my understanding that traditionally you take biology as a sophomore and US history as a junior. And so, and for the class of 2022, they would have been sophomores when they received biology instruction, but they were not offered the test at that time. So if they were to pass one of these, their greatest chance, I believe, but I want you to verify that, would have been to pass biology, and that your greatest chance of passing a test is when you actually have the instruction.
I can directly respond to the first part. The first part is that the biology exam has a higher pass rate than the US history exam.
Can you give us
by
some specifics?
Between 50 and 20 percentage points?
More?
Yes.
Okay. So if any student in the state is more likely to pass a biology test than they are a US history test.
That's true, yes.
Okay. And they were sophomores, taking biology. Now, some of them got lucky, and they're taking US history, and all of them are going to be sitting on the stage. But not all. I mean, that's a small percentage that would have taken both as a sophomore.
So while you're there, can you answer the question about the students that were in that cohort that year, and the waiver was applied, regardless if they were in biology or history or both? Did the waiver exempt them from taking the test and the graduation requirement for passing the test or not?
If they were enrolled in the course concurrently, then being in the course in the spring of 2020 meant that they met the assessment requirement. They were in both classes at the same time. If they were not in both classes at the same time, meaning they had previously taken the course in the pair or they needed to take the course in the pair later, they had to pass it in order to meet the assessment requirement. So for example, if you were in US history and biology at the same time and passed both of the classes during spring 2020, you met the requirement. If you were in biology, you did not have to have the assessment as part of your final exam grade, but you would subsequently have to take the US history in the course exam. Another example would be a student who was on a jumpstart pathway who's not required to take geometry. If they were in algebra in spring of 2020, and they passed the course, they would receive an exemption from passing that exam. They would meet the requirement because they don't have a second pair to take that they're required to take. Does that add more clarity or less?
I'm not sure I need to repeat to make sure I got it right. Okay, well, real important concept to me. So one of the two is required. You just have to pass one of the two. So let's keep it simple and let's say the two that seem to be most challenging are history and biology. So graduate, have to pass one of the two. So if I was in the sophomore class in 2020 and I passed biology, but I did not take the test, but I got a waiver, does the graduation requirement for biology still apply to me, even though I didn't take the test, but I have a waiver?
It does not satisfy the science and social studies pair. You have to.
No, I'm just focusing on the biology requirement, just trying to keep it simple.
There is not a biology requirement in and of itself.
Well, you have to take one of the two, okay? And in this particular case, if I do get the waiver, I'm satisfied, and the waiver applies to the graduation requirement, then check the box. I've satisfied one of those two, right?
The policy that was adopted mirrors the transfer policy, and the transfer policy is interpreted to be that when a student enters having taken the course already, they don't have to pass the exam for it. But if they have to take a course subsequently that is in the same pair, they have to pass the exam.
Well, why would they have to take the course subsequently if they've already satisfied the first one because they got the waiver?
Because the student will have to take U.S. history to graduate.
Okay, so then bottom line, you're saying that the waiver does not check the box for the graduation requirement?
Correct.
Okay, that's what I need to
Subsequent, once they were enrolled in both courses in the pair at the same time and starting 2020.
Okay, wait, so why does that make a difference if I was enrolled?
Because they don't have to subsequently take the course. If they were to take the course later, then that wouldn't.
Got it, just got it.
Or if they had taken the course previously, prior to spring of 2020, and failed the end of course exam, that would also not have worked. It had to be your first time taking the course and the assessment.
Got it. So if I'm that unique student that scheduled both courses in the same year, then I check the box for both with the waiver?
Yes,
What
sir.
do you need?
I have another clarifying question, and I think the superintendent is the one that gave these stats, but I heard something about 6% of students didn't graduate in 2021. And did you say that's because of LEAP? But I didn't think,
It wasn't didn't graduate, but wouldn't have met assessment requirements.
they
We
would
just
not
wanted-
have met it.
We were trying to
Okay,
get really good comparison data.
Okay.
So we looked at all.
all right. And in 2021, was that the year that if students had not met it, then they could meet it through substitute with the ACT composite of 17 in a content area, a work piece exam, or additional instruction?
I don't have all the details right in front of me, but they are covered in the bulletin.
Page 3, that's the
Okay.
page
Okay.
2.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions from any BESE members? Okay, Ms. Holloway?
Well, there is one question, and I'm not sure if Tom's here to answer, but I'd like to understand if a child can walk across the stage if he doesn't have the credentials.
Yeah, well, we have Ms. Hunt here to address that issue.
Yes, there's nothing in the law about graduation ceremonies. That's purely a local decision as to how they want to handle their graduation ceremonies and if they want to allow a student to walk across the stage. I know we've had situations where a student walked across the stage and got the diploma thing, but there was no diploma in it. They were just handed something so they weren't embarrassed in front of their peers, I guess. But that is purely a local decision. There's no law on that.
So just to be clear, I've got some emails saying that BESE, in its current position, is preventing some students from walking across the stage. And you're saying that that is a local decision.
Now,
not
whether they
BESE's
graduate, that's a different question, whether they graduate from whether they walk across the
decision.
stage.
I'm just talking about walking across the
Yeah,
stage.
but that's a local decision.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question. So what does this graduation typically symbolize to our communities? The graduation ceremony? Walking across the stage?
The completion of high school.
High school graduation? So it's a public ceremony that local school systems put on to demonstrate to the public who all graduated. So why would someone who does not meet the requirements to graduate walk across the stage?
The situations which I'm familiar with, when we first started having the, I forgot what we called it.
Can you turn your
The
mic
diploma
on?
for- Oh, sorry. The diploma for special education students, it wasn't the full diploma. And I know we had some situations where students were allowed to walk across the stage just to, I guess, publicly satisfy that they were ending their high school career even though they weren't graduating with a diploma. But again, that's a local decision. That's nothing in the law. It's not in BESE policy.
So it's a local decision, but it's also an extremely common practice?
It is.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Bocek?
Just to comment on that specific issue, and I'm reserving my others for a little bit later. When we hold graduation ceremonies, there's also a local accountability issue that's in concert with state accountability. And every principal or person who gets up, that language, even when we had special education students that got a different diploma years ago, the statement was always made that the graduates who are out here have met every requirement from the state of Louisiana for graduation and we had certificates of achievement, that's what it was called, certificates of achievement, high school diploma, or whatever. That included those special education students, but it included every student who met the state graduation requirements. So when we say that's a local decision or whatever, we are certifying to the public every time we hold that ceremony that every student out there participating in the ceremony has met every requirement. These students would not be meeting the requirement if we do not take some action today for them. And then they're told to change their tassels over to signify that they have completed all requirements of this school and the state of Louisiana for graduation and are now going out into the world for their next endeavor. And I don't know, I've been to several different parishes and school systems that have done that. That language of the ones that I've attended has always been there. It's definitely always been there in ours. So we certify to the public in full transparency that night or day of graduation that every student participating has met all graduation requirements for the state of Louisiana.
And I think as a follow-up, with Ms. Boche and also Ms. Jones, students have the opportunity to get remediated over summer. So will those students have the opportunity to receive their diploma, their credentials, their IBC? You know, if they don't walk across stage and they haven't met these
Right, they're
requirements.
not in the ceremony when they do complete it. I think Mr. Morris was asking what are options for kids who don't complete it? Well, if they don't complete it here in May and participate in the graduation ceremony and certify, they come back to high school in many cases. They go through a summer session, they come back in the fall or the next year just to retake these tests and potentially pass them. So it does delay according, like to Dr. Bofi, for example, their entrance into the workforce or into, many of them won't be able to go to any kind of post-secondary training without, depending upon what is required for that post-secondary training. So it would delay a summer entrance into some of these programs. It would also delay a fall entrance if that child is still trying to obtain those credentials in the fall. It depends upon what program they're going to, the job they're going to, or what their future endeavor is. So yes, there are other opportunities to come back and take it. You can come back and take it at the end of the summer. You can come back at the end of the fall and take it again in December. There's a testing cycle, as we know. So that would mean though in some cases delay of additional training or the workforce, depending upon the amount of time, they would have to be invested in the remediation and preparation procedures.
Superintendent Rowe?
I was just going to echo what Superintendent Bochet shared, Ms. Holloway, that as a system superintendent, that was always, and as a principal, that was always my experience. If they didn't pass that test, they would come back in for the summer, and potentially at times come back in the fall.
I think I have one more question to clarify. I'm not sure you can answer this, but when we're looking at this waiver for statewide, I think about the students who have completed the requirements, who have worked extremely hard, and I don't know the percentage, the number, based on Thomas, you gave 1,000 that are in this mix here. What would it say to these students who worked extremely hard to get to this point and met all the credentials, the requirements to graduate, and yet we do have the challenges, we understand that, we have guys with that, from hurricanes to tornadoes to COVID, and we have this group of students. And we passed this state waiver for the state. Does this mean that as of today, once it's passed, that these students who are in this group will automatically not move forward with the completion of the LEAP test or any other type of remediation that needs to be required for them to graduate? So I'm trying to differentiate here. Those students who really performed, met the requirements, et cetera, versus those that are struggling.
Ms. Steinberg, if you could come back, I think this might be more of a question for you. And Ms. Holloway, try and clarify if I could, correct me if I'm wrong. And if I am, maybe a related question is, the students that have not met the requirement that passing the test, that could come back and take a class this summer, if we issue a waiver today, are they less likely to try to take that remediation this summer because considering that they no longer need it? Would less children be likely to enroll in remediation classes and take the test this summer?
I checked with Joan as I was coming over, because I think that once a student graduates, we believe that once a student graduates, remediation would no longer be required because the student does not need to pass that assessment in order to graduate. So it would effectively end the requirement for that student to participate in remediation.
But the remediation may be required prior to issuing the waiver if the 17 is not on the ACT. So one of the waiver
substitution
criteria of substitution is remediation.
Yes,
So many of them would have to take that prior to issuance. It would be the same as if we issued this. My understanding, it's the same waiver that we issued last year for the class of 2021. And one of those, either you're substituting a 17 on the ACT, or you're up the jumpstart, the civil work keys, or you can do the remediation prior to the granting and issuance of the requirement.
Right, the question was, after the graduation, would they be required to do remediation? Would they be less likely to participate in remediation? Prior to the graduation for remediation, yes, but they wouldn't be required to have remediation into the summer for that student, or have them take the assessment during the summer either. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, so then it brings me to the dollar, you know, the money that was spent for remediation for these children. And what happens there? Okay.
Okay, Ms. Davis, Dr. Davis.
Thomas, can you tell me, you mentioned that the gap between biology and American or U.S. history is between 15 and 20% in terms of the passage rate. When it comes to the other pairs of tests, algebra and geometry and English 1 and English 2, are the gaps that large? And
I do not believe so.
okay, so then my question is, what's wrong with our US history test, first of all. And I guess, or maybe what's wrong with the biology test. But it brings up an issue to me then that kids who are on the more typical path, which is biology their sophomore year and US history their junior year, are systematically disadvantaged by what we're doing. Because we waived them taking the biology test the year that school shut down, but we require them to take the American or US history test. And that test is harder for students to pass across the entire state. And it's my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, I would like to know, and you might not know this answer, how many of our schools are having students, because US history is so hard to pass, go back and try to pass that biology test and being successful. And so to me, if that's what they're doing right, then there really is a systematic disadvantage for these kids. Because, well, first of all, passing the biology test is going to be harder because it's been a year since they've had that course and they didn't even finish it. But yet they're still managing to pass that test if they can't pass the US history test that they're enrolled in right now. And so to me, that points out that perhaps we need to be taking a look at that test and that we're well served to be switching to civics because clearly this is a problem. Those are just my thoughts on it.
Ms. Boche?
Could you, Thomas, tell me again, when we did virtual learning and we did that data that we're talking about, looking at data, kids who participated in virtual hybrid learning get a lower passage rate. I'm talking 3 through, not just this one dynamic on this one test, but when we looked at our data from this past school year, and we do know that when we talk about the effects of COVID, this is the class that in March 13th of 2020, we shut down. So 9 weeks of that instruction loss, no state testing. But we didn't test 3rd through the other grades as well. Then we came back last school year, and we all know the disruption of last school year. And I know in my district and in many districts, we try to do in-person learning 5 days a week for those 3rd through 8th grade kids. High school kids, because of the numbers and because of COVID, many districts did either virtual a good part of the year, a hybrid version where kids in high school maybe came to in-person learning 2 days a week, at the most 3 days a week. And that whole year last year was a major disruption. And that's one of the reasons when this board sat down last year and looked at the waiver for this class of 2021, we did grant it for that group. But all last year, that major disruption because of hybrid learning or total virtual learning. I don't remember offhand, do you remember what was the scores were low about what percent? Superintendent Brumfield might remember that our scores dipped significantly, as did the ones all across the country.
So because we had a 97% participation rate, we had good data.
Yes.
Which was important as systems such as yours built comeback plans to be able to target specific things. We know that we had disproportionate impact to our youngest learners in the subject of math, some of our subgroups, and then finally, to your point, virtual instruction. And so we were able to break that out into quartiles based on the percent of time a student was face-to-face versus virtual. I don't remember the numbers in between, but I can tell you on the polar opposite end, it was a 15-point swing between fully face-to-face and fully virtual.
We had a 15-point swing there. So last year when these kids were taking the U.S. history, and they were impacted with, remember as sophomores, they were taking most of them, English 2, geometry, and biology. And then some were even having U.S. history, as we've heard, as their sophomore year. But at least 3 of those exit exams, 3 of those 2025 tests, they didn't take as sophomores. They didn't take English 2. They didn't take geometry. and they didn't take biology. So even though they got course credit, they didn't have the availability of taking that LEAP 2025 course. So each of the 3 courses that those 3 courses were paired with meant that those kids had to pass the other one. They didn't have the option of passing either one, they had to pass the other one. So that, this class we're talking about, so disruptive, that's not going to be it. Then they come back as juniors, and they're in an environment which in many cases is totally virtual or hybrid environment, quarantining many times because of close contacts, being out a lot, with a major disruption that year. So now we're into the graduation cycle. Yeah, we got a lot of money coming in, but these kids also get all these other courses they have to take to graduate. Not to during the day maybe go back and try to remediate some of these other ones. So we're looking at after school, while kids are working. We're looking at myriad of problems. We're also looking at all the emotional, social issues that we're dealing with kids. This is a class that has had no normalcy whatsoever throughout their high school careers. Now, in St. Bernard Parish, we had 18 kids in that biology U.S. history split who weren't going to graduate because they waived the biology, failed the U.S. history. We gathered them together, and we talk about the differential and the difficulty of the test. They hadn't been in biology for 2 years. We prepped them a little, I mean, and this is, and you know, you can call it game in the system, you can call it whatever you want. We prepped them for a period of time. 14 of the 18 went back and passed a biology exam that they had not been in the course for 2 years, but still couldn't pass the U.S. histories because of the level of difficulty, and they were out of that. So, I mean, there are so many issues around this, and to be honest, this is the last class we're talking about. We gave a waiver in 2020 because we shut down and did tests. We gave a waiver to the class of 2021 because of the disruption. This particular class has been through 3 years of their 4 years of total uncertainty and a mess in their high school careers. And we can talk about the Fed's given us $1 zillion for remediation. We can talk about what schools may have done a better job than others. And I venture to say, many of our schools, including our own, have done an unbelievable job in trying to get these kids and offering opportunities. But when, as Dr. Bophy says, you look at Tommy, you look at Ronnie, you look at Kate, every child has a different story of what their life is and what is happening. You have an English language learner that has IBC credentials, but such a poor command of the English language, he can't pass that U.S. history because of the application, or maybe that English too. All the kids who in special education, because of Act 833, was waived. So we're not talking about SPED kids, because these children who are in special education don't have to pass these tests. If they have this other, criteria that it's part of their, we won't, get into that discussion. Other than that, we're not talking about the SPED arena. That's why we don't have a lot of the special ed advocates on. Because those kids are not subject to these same regulations. All the SPED kids are on that stage graduating and getting that diploma. We're talking about this small group of kids that are struggling, who have had their educations impacted for 3 years now in all kinds of different ways, and who each have a different life story and where they are. And they have passed every course they need to pass. They have gone through, if they're in a Jumpstart pathway, that particular training. Schools throughout the state of Louisiana, teachers, counselors, principals, superintendents have done everything they can. You can give me $1 billion, and there are a couple of these kids that $1 billion isn't going to impact to get them to pass that US history test or whatever. And when we see the difference, if we say in 2019, we know in our accountability system, we're going to have a small group of kids who aren't going to make it. Good, bad, or indifferent, they're not going to make it. But there's a differential. When we say a difference from 4% to 7%, there is a differential here. And it is because I truly believe the impact of what these kids have been living through for the last 3 years. The impact of COVID. This is the last class that I think this board is going to have to deal with this with. Because next year, it should not be an issue. And we go back to whatever accountability system we decide to adopt and we put into place and whatever the criteria are. But we did it in 2020 and we did it in 2021. What I'm asking people around this table to look at, this should be the last time we have to address this. And these are real children, real families, real communities. And whether you got the money to remediate them or not, that's not the issue. This is a kid issue. This is not, what are we doing with our accountability system at some point in the future or whatever. This is, has this child done everything we've asked him to do? And has he operated under a handicap in meeting this requirement? And I think if you honestly ask yourself that question, these kids have been operating under a handicap for these past 3 years. An academic handicap, a social handicap, an emotional handicap, and all of that together are contributing factors. Now, I'm hoping that in our country and in our communities, we're not going to have to deal with this particular situation again. I'm hoping we're not going to get into more COVID issues. But again, please, y'all, remember, this is the last year that we should be looking at this. Then we go back to, yeah, we will always have some kids who aren't going to necessarily meet this and they're going to have to look at other options. We have a disproportionate number of kids this year. And when we honestly look at it, I don't think anybody can say that it's because these kids were not affected by what has happened to them these past 3 years. And look at it from the kid's point of view and that family. We are not lessening or destroying the integrity of the system that we put out there. We're making human decisions for human beings based on circumstances beyond their control. And then next year, I could say that if I'm faced with this, I would not approve a waiver. This year, for this class, have some humanity in here, because this is not negatively going to impact accountability, it's not negatively going to impact anything going forward. How do we deal with kids who have been disproportionately impacted by these educational experiences?
Mr. Morris? Thank you, Mr. Gordon. So Superintendent Boucher partially answered one of my questions. I'm not sure if Mr. Lambert is the right person to answer this or not, but I'm still trying to understand the difference between schools that were successful and schools that were not. So we had a 7% student population here that we're talking about. That's 3% more than 2019. So my math says that's about 1,000 students here that we're talking about. The differential between 2019 and what we're talking about today. So potentially there's 1,000 students that are impacted. And we talked about that 7% and what Superintendent Boucher articulated some of the challenges. And spoke a little bit too about maybe some of the characteristics of that student group. But I'd like to hear more about the, say, the 2,400 students, the 7% is the total population, and do we identify them as coming from high-performing schools, low-performing schools, from rural schools, or are there any other significances that stand out? That's my first question.
I don't think there are any really clear patterns in that data. No. there are schools that would have had fewer students that need to meet that U.S. history biology waiver, U.S. history biology requirement, because they have students in the same course at the same time.
Okay, and then, we have 7% that aren't there yet, but we have 93% that are there, right? So I'd like to hear, I don't know if there's folks present today or if there's anybody from LDOE that could help us with it, but what do we attribute the 93% success rate to? What is it that they did? You just told us that the population is the same across, so it's not, one particular student characteristic. It's uniform across the state. So every school's got the challenge. So if that's the case, then some of those schools, 93% of them, were successful, working with a similar group of kids. So I'd like to understand, here's some of the success stories, and what was it that they did, right, that they attribute their success to? And then I had one other question for Superintendent Brumley. I recall, my memory's good for 2 years, Superintendent Brumley, but I recall when I first got on BESE that you shared with us that the typical, maybe it was state average, schedule for a high school senior is about 40–50% of the day. Is that accurate? And if so, is that accurate for this cohort?
I have not full data relative to this cohort on this particular question, but yeah, I want to say, I don't have the exact number, Mr. Wilson, but I want to say somewhere around 45% of students did not have their full academic course load their senior year. And that would have been from a couple of years ago when we were trying to launch the Fast Forward initiative, which has since launched.
So do we have any indication if that is characteristic of this particular cohort or not?
I would assume it's probably similar.
Okay, Mr. Morris, you had some questions that you just asked. I don't think you got answers to those yet, right?
Right. I was still, yeah, we can clear that and move on to the next. What do we attribute the 93% success rate to? 93%, that's an A, right? So we're not talking about the majority were successful, right? So I'm trying to understand how do we get appreciation for what that group did, right? And why other schools weren't able to implement the same successful strategies for their students. So I'd just like to hear some more about the success stories and what worked, and then why weren't the other schools able to implement and execute the same strategy?
Yeah, I think it's too early in our data to be able to answer that question. I mean, for instance, as I mentioned, we still have 1,000 students in the queue for U.S. history and 1,000 in biology. So for us to be able to determine on a system level or a school level at this point, I think that'll be hard for us to do with data. So I don't want to just offer anecdotal here. I'd rather have more accurate information. And I
We will always have kids who don't make it. But the question is, with the class of 2022, have their experiences over these last 3 years contributed more negatively to this outcome than a regular graduating class would have? And I think the honest answer to that is yes. But we're not going to get to 100% on a passage of these LEAD 2025 tests. We'll never have 0 unsatisfactories.
Mr. Castillo.
I'd like to try to respond to Mr. Morris, and it's anecdotal, but it's like, I guess all of us, we've gotten a lot of feedback from superintendents and constituents, but I've heard from a lot of the superintendents in my district. And again, I represent some of the highest performing districts, Zachary, Central, West Louisiana, and with those districts, I don't think Superintendent Milton would mind me sharing our conversation this morning. I said, I like your perspective. And his perspective was, we're doing fine. And as a district, but he said, I recognize that, that's not true for everyone. Everyone's been impacted. He respects and thinks that our accountability system is very, very important. Appreciate all of that. But then and so, he was really trying to give me an honest response. Now, at the same time, I've got some of the most disadvantaged poorer districts that said, look, a lot of families that didn't have internet, broadband access, but a lot of kids that we couldn't reach, certainly 2 years ago, a year ago, and even this year, that really struggled. And so the answer, again, may not be what necessarily the school is doing that it can control, but other issues beyond their control. And then the challenge for us is, well, that might be such a small population. Maybe it's 100 kids, maybe it's 200 kids. And is our response that, well, they just fell through the crack and it's okay because we're just going to lose some and we'll have casualties of war, of the pandemic. Is that an acceptable response for those few hundred that we might have? Or is there something that we should consider doing about it, which is why Dr. Bofi has us here talking about it today? Because there is a number, and I suspect there are parents in the audience and parents who are listening who probably can attest to, I hear all of you, that sounds great in terms of big numbers, but let me tell you about my child. And a number of superintendents, now I try to get them to come so that they can articulate, I'm not carrying the message for them, but because of your question, Mr. Morris, to the extent, because we don't have perfect data, and many of them who wanted to attend shared, and we were copied, several of us were copied on several email messages and text messages. It is different. The Frush is a good example. We approved last meeting a waiver for the Frush because of extenuating circumstances, a combination, if I recall the rationale, of both Hurricane Ida and the pandemic. It was a combination of both, coupled together. And heard from superintendent in St. Helena, she said, same thing, we were impacted by Ida and a lot of other pandemic. We had a lot of parishes, a lot of students, a lot of different circumstances. And we've got a difficult job because we want to be true to the fact that we want to have high standards, we want to push our kids as much as possible. But at this moment in time, what do? We want to complicate things a little bit more because a good friend of mine sent me a text who was watching and said, we're actually having graduation ceremonies now, tonight. So I know you guys are over there working, but I'm frankly a little concerned that whatever you're doing might be too little too late because some of us are proceeding with graduation ceremonies as we speak. Just offer that to just make this even more complicated than when we started the conversation. But that said, there was a superintendent that said, if you're going to make a mistake, he was told this when he first started out in leadership, that his superintendent said, if you're going to err, if you're going to make a mistake, make sure that you err on the side of helping the child. That is, if you did something that helped the child and you were wrong, well, you can live with that. We should all be able to live with that. But not err in another way. So just something for us all to consider.
Okay, Ms. Bowman?
Well, one, I'm really interested in hearing the public testimony, but two, I do want to point out that the 93% can't be viewed as a 93% success rate because the way that the information was framed is that 7% of students still haven't met that mark. On their transcripts, it's called a grad test. And I've been looking at transcripts for a couple of years now, I just found it, and it says yes or no. Some students are meeting the grad test because they weren't tested or they have some kind of exemption. It doesn't mean that they met that mark. And that's part of this conversation because this is about the whole class of 2022 and doing the right thing for the whole class of 2022. I'm concerned that our data system is not sophisticated enough to tell us which ones are in that, pass that grad test because of exemptions and which ones pass the grad test because of outright success. But I will defer to Mr. Lambert to let me know.
For students for whom we have transcripts, we know whether or not they have it. So we only looked at students who we had assessment data on. So students who haven't sat for an assessment, it can be for a variety of reasons. They could be transferring from out of state, having already taken the course, etc. We excluded those students from the analysis because they likely have a different type of waiver and we can't know for sure. The data that we looked at is actually, did the student pass the three pairs that they needed to pass or not? We actually looked at that data. The data system is sophisticated enough to do that.
Did you look at whether or not they were exempted? So does that include the ones who were sophomores and took biology and they're not part of your 93% then? Because they didn't pass a test. They were exempted from both biology and US history.
They would have been included in there because we knew that they had the waiver.
So I'm saying we can't claim 93%. 93% is not something we can claim because we exempted those children. But they're going to be sitting in the graduation ceremonies, right? And the children that I'm talking about that are not sitting in the graduation ceremonies didn't take US history and biology at the same time.
But they would be in the 7%.
Right. The point I'm making is that we can't celebrate 93% as saying 93% of the students passed what did they needed to in the grad test. I know we've got, I don't know what the percentage is, but some of them passed the grad test. Others passed the grad test because they had some kind of exemption because of the year they took their test.
There are students for whom, as we said earlier, they took the US history and biology at the same time, so they did not have to pass the same test that other students would have had to.
Okay, Superintendent, you mentioned that Dr. Timball had some information for us.
Yeah, I mean, it's been mentioned a few times, and Superintendent Boucher even quoted a zillion, but I thought it, a zillion dollars. But I thought it might be good to have Dr. Timball come up and just talk about some of the key areas where high schools have invested their stimulus dollars over the last year. Louisiana is one of a handful of states, in my opinion, that has a really thoughtful plan around asking systems how they're going to spend money and trying to get them to collaborate around a few key ideas and areas and then tracking them. So at a future date, Mr. Morris, we might be able to cross-reference those things from here and that information. But I just at a minimum, I wanted Dr. Timball to come and share some of the main categories of expenses from the stimulus dollars at our high schools.
I looked at my watch to see if I was saying good morning or good afternoon, so good afternoon is now afternoon. So Quintina Timball, just going to talk just a little bit about some of the Escrow Funds that's been allocated, appropriated to the state, and then rolled out either by incentive dollars or formula dollars to our districts and how they spend the money. Just as a total indication of money that's been contributed to high school support, we have about $15 million that's been budgeted across all of our districts and any incentive investments that we've made. So that's your dollar amount. But some of the things that are most common in our budgets or either in the Louisiana Comeback Plan, what we noticed a lot of systems did when we had our CIR, UIR schools through Super App, expanding high-quality opportunities, high-quality assessments, investing in teacher stipends, professional development at those CIR schools. Many of our systems expanded those opportunities across all schools because we were just initially giving money for CIR and UIR schools. So many expanded those opportunities, but very specific to our high schools around high school support, specifically around accelerated learning, summer learning. Many systems hosted credit recovery, retest opportunities, during the day instructional learning. I hear many systems call it like skinny models to where they're doing before school tutoring during the day, instructional small group settings. Even in high school, we saw some of that throughout our Louisiana Comeback Plans. We also saw after school tutoring opportunities. Many systems did choose to hold their own summer learning programs, but some systems also utilized vendors to run virtual summer learning opportunities for high school students. Other specific examples that was very prevalent would be IGPs, extending the individual graduation plans through like Career Compass or any of our other IGP partners so that students could get more individualized coaching on those IGP plans. I would refer to that as name tag accountability. Students really had a plan that indicated where they needed assessments, where they needed other courses, and so you saw a lot of systems really planning around things of that nature. Another big component was, of course, in salaries and benefits. That was about $5.5 million. And so when you look at that, many systems paid teacher stipends to run those summer programs or to do some of the extended learning opportunities before or after school, hired additional graduation coaches, again, to give that individualized support to students, staffing plans for the year that we did both hybrid and face-to-face instruction. So there were many, I think that's like very, very high level. As far as some of the very specific around salaries, benefits, professional development, we did see an increase in like digital textbooks, making sure students had the access to curriculum. Another, I would say another expense was just around any additional testing opportunities or expanding AP or dual enrollment opportunities, ACT assessments. So I'll stop there, just giving you all a pretty high-level overview of what we saw a lot of relative to high school support within the Louisiana Comeback Plans.
Mr. Morris.
So, Dr. Tillman, you mentioned, you made references to $15 million for high schools and $5.5 million for stipends. Those
salaries and benefits, not just stipends. Within salaries and benefits, stipends would be a component.
Okay. Well, those, I'm asking a question, those funds are relative to the 10% of the $4 billion that flow to LDOE. Is that correct?
It's reflective of both incentive and formula. So, for example, with SO1, our formula budgeted total at a separate amount, and then our incentivized formula total at a separate amount, and that's budgeted. So it represents both.
So of the $4 billion number that everybody's talking about, right? That's 90% the districts and 10% at LDOE's discretion. So what I'm trying to get to is the $20 million that you referenced. That's out of the whole pie. That's out of the whole 100%. Okay. And then I only had two questions. My other question was you referenced the IGP. Does every senior have an IGP?
Well,
Let me ask you a different one. Does every student have an IGP?
IGPs actually begin in 8th grade, and so from your 8th grade, I think they start planning there, and so yes, it follows them through.
So every student's got an IGP. Okay, thank you.
Okay, we have a lot of comment cards. Maybe we should start running through those and then come back to questions from the desk members. Unless there's any objections, let's go ahead and do that.
The 3-5 standards. 3-4.
Okay, let's do our standard, our typical length of time. We have Michael Falk, Megan Brown, and Tanya Watson. Toya Watson. Please, if y'all could come down, and we'll give Michael Falk first.
First on the list, Michael Falk, Executive Director of the Louisiana Association of School Superintendents. We appreciate Dr. Bofi bringing this item because there's a lot of concern, a lot of parents and students that are waiting to hear, as you've had the discussion. We have several superintendents, 2019 and 2020. In their junior year, we have 20 and 21. Had an impact on their state assessments. During those years, we experienced the closing of schools. We experienced shifting to online instruction. We experienced hybrid learning with staggered days. What we asked the board to do is to consider adopting an emergency rule which considers these factors and provide the flexibility, the waiver for the graduating seniors of 2021's 2022 school year. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon. I don't want to reiterate many of the things that everyone has already said, but I know many of us have saw the defense with the little kids standing on the boxes, and it's in the conversation about equity, and in this instance, lack thereof. And I know that you had a question about what are others doing right and wrong, but I think that that's not the comparison we should make or think about in this conversation. It's not so much of what the other schools are doing right and what the schools that are not as successful are doing wrong. I think it's more so on what we are doing wrong as a state. And we know that lack of equity is an issue because we talk about equity. And of course, in this short amount of time, I can't have an equity conversation with you. But as I go through the journey of our senior class, I do want you to keep equity in your minds, okay? Because I'm from Concordia Parish where there are some issues. No, we don't have a lot of children that was affected by this, that's true. But if it's one, then that's too many. The class of 2022, I would like to call them tenacious, resilient, and dear to my heart. And one of the things that I noticed about that class is that they are one. So I know that another question was asked was, how will the other children feel? Well, we know that when we write our mission statements, we don't write a mission statement that says that we're preparing them to pass the LEAP test. We write a mission statement that says that we're preparing them to be productive citizens in the world. That means that we are teaching them to be one and be together. So how the other students will feel, I can guarantee you that they will feel elated that their classmates are getting to graduate with them. The last thing that I want to point out to you is that as superintendent, I must say that I was not prepared. The 2019-2020 school year, last school year was an eye-opener to us all. We got a lot of money, and I am one to say I am extremely thankful for it, and I am not complaining. But there's one thing that money cannot buy us, and that's time. There's no store we can walk into and ask for that extra time that those students missed that 10th grade year. The 11th grade year, we followed the CDC policy, where we had our students quarantined a great deal of time. My own daughter was out of school more than she was in school. And I can say that, yes, she's going to pass all tests because she has the luxury of a private tutor. She has the luxury that most of my students don't have. I myself came on Saturday mornings and I tutor students on Saturdays. So it's not a matter of our children not trying. It's a matter of just honestly, things were against them that they couldn't fight. So today I'm asking for your compassion. I'm asking you to think about equity and lack thereof because it's just not 100% in our state, and we all know that, as evidenced by the equity committee that our state superintendent has put together. Keep that in mind, and today I ask that you all of you, not some, I would like for all of you to just be with us on this and allow our children the waiver for one more year. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Megan Brown. I'm Superintendent of Schools for East Carroll Parish. And just quickly to mirror the sentiments about equity, and for those of you who are not familiar with East Carroll Parish was featured my senior year in high school as the poorest place in the nation. Recently, within the last 10 years, we were featured as an unequal divide as far as growth is concerned. So, Mr. Morris, when you talk about what one district is doing and what one is not, I come from a parish that has a high rate of intergenerational poverty and intergenerational literacy. And when we're comparing ourselves, even just with neighboring districts, the high level of poverty alone, the lack of equity, there's no comparisons. And I did stay up till 1 o'clock last night, not really thinking I was going to have to speak, but at the same token, if I don't fight for my kids, who is? And I just had a few things that I wanted to say to you. First, I want to thank you for your service and all that you do for the children of Louisiana. And as we all very well know, we've spoken here this morning, that the last 3 school terms have been nothing short of extraordinary. We've lived through a time unlike any other in our lifetime, a time in which our students have suffered significantly due to learning loss, lost instructional time, and social disconnect from their peers in society. It is evident that disruptions to learning have continued to negatively impact students well past the initial school closures of 2020. To address student learning loss and deficiencies, we provide accelerated summer learning, enrichment programs, and activities to support social emotional learning, high dosage after-school tutoring programs, in-school tutoring, and remediation programs. All of those opportunities were both in-person and virtual. Remediation efforts were often disrupted as well due to fear of COVID and quarantine. I'm here today desperately asking for your help to provide the graduating senior class of 2022 who have persevered through the abrupt interruption of their sophomore year, the turmoil of transitioning to virtual learning their junior year, and tasked with re-engaging socially and emotionally their senior year. And respectively, this class has only completed 1 full term of high school, and that was their freshman year. That was uninterrupted. I plead with you to afford them the opportunity that they deserve to pursue their dreams of attending college, completing an apprenticeship, learning a technical trade, entering the workforce, and discovering their life's purpose to make their mark on society that they deserve. Please join Washington, Florida, Arkansas, Connecticut, New Jersey, and other states and educational entities who granted some form of a waiver or leniency for their 2022 graduates. We would like all students to be afforded the same opportunity and equity, such as homeschool students who will be issued a diploma, but they don't have to satisfy state testing requirements. I want to point out to you some significant deficiencies that directly impacted the class of 2022 in my district, and I'm sure as well as in others. I also want to thank you for providing the safe operational guidelines for opening schools. We implemented mitigating measures such as mask mandates, routine temperature checks, routine COVID testing, air purifiers, PPE and sanitizing supplies, foggers and plexiglass barriers, to name a few. Yet despite all of these valiant efforts, we still face significant setbacks in providing an optimal education experience this year and last year. We had a delay to the start of school for the last 2 years because of high community spread. We suffered significant difficulties with limited bandwidth and broadband access within our community as we offered virtual learning opportunities to students over the past 2 years. I personally called Verizon to address tower issues we launched the use of MiFi devices to transition to virtual last school term. Last year, 65 to 70% of our students were virtual, which directly correlated with our test scores, making more prevalent the test score gaps between students in low poverty and high poverty school districts. This year,
if you could wrap up.
yes, sir, I hope you
appreciate it.
24% of our seniors were virtual this year due to personal and family health issues. Last year and this year, we had severe staffing shortages, little to no available substitutes or retirees, high absentee rates, and quarantine. We had, in a couple instances, over 40% of our faculty members were either ill or had to quarantine, causing us to shut down our school district this school term. 30% of our senior class alone had to quarantine 15 to 20% of the school term, which reflected additional lost learning time. Our welding and CNA class alone on 4 occasions had to quarantine, which meant 35% of the time they were not in school. And that's 40% of our senior class. And I'm going to go on and go. Thank you.
Thank you. Next 3 speakers will be Warren Gleason, Paul Nelson, and John Bartholomew.
Mr. President, as they're coming up, and as Superintendent Brown, you haven't emailed that to us, you may have, I apologize. Would you do that so that we'll have it for our record?
Yes, sir. Thank you. I'm sorry for being so long.
No, that was great, but I like the data that you quoted.
Yes, sir, Mr. Lawrence.
Yeah, she raised another question that I have on this. I just want to go ahead and put it out there so maybe somebody else will cover it in their testimony. But I just want to make sure that we check all our boxes here when we consider what's in play. Last year, I had asked Superintendent Brumley and his team to help us to appreciate the portfolio of teachers in the state. How many certified teachers do we have? How many uncertified? How many vacancies do we have? And how dependent are we on the substitute system? From my personal experience as a substitute in my district, I have a lot of appreciation for that. So that's why I'm asking the question, is if we have a high school graduation requirement that, in this case, the hurdle seems to be biology, do we have enough biology teachers in the state? Is that part of the problem, that we don't have biology teachers to teach the class? Is that part of our 2,500 estimate for teacher shortages? I'd just like to make sure that we ask that question. I think it's unreasonable if we can't supply a biology teacher that we expect that to be part of the graduation requirement. But if we have, if it's not an issue, then okay, we can go on, but I just like, I think it's a relevant question.
Okay, Ms. Gleason.
Sure. Thank you all very much. My name is Lauren Gleason. I'm representing Lobby with the State Chamber of Commerce. There's a lot of things that have been discussed here today, and no doubt there are a lot of issues that need to be looked at, but I think this proposal is premature and very concerning for a lot of reasons. And so, as I said, representing the State Chamber of Commerce and thousands of businesses, we hear from members every day about not just the lack of workforce, but the lack of an educated workforce. People cannot read and write well enough to fill out a simple job application. Students aren't able to get certifications or even into apprenticeship programs because their GPAs are not high enough, or they can't get to that 17, 18, 19, whatever the number is on the ACT. The world around us is only getting more rigorous, and we cannot afford to tell our children otherwise because it makes the adults in the room feel better. And yet we stand here today discussing telling high school seniors who cannot pass that they are ready to enter the working world or whatever higher education endeavors they aspire to. And then when they cannot get a job or they cannot get into college or community college, what will we tell them? That it is not our problem anymore? The situations we've just talked about here are very concerning. But for the students in certain districts, there are thousands of others who may not be ready. And so do we make a statewide exemption to help those special cases? And we are right, the communities do need workers, but we need workers who have graduated from high school and are prepared for the job market. Graduates who are just out in the world who cannot get a job, who don't help anyone, and further a lot of situations that we've talked about. And then students passing a test are not a recent development. As we've discussed, what have schools been doing with their federal dollars and required remediation plans to help those students who are having issues passing the test? I believe that the ones who will suffer the most from a policy like this are the students, and I appreciate you listening to my testimony today.
Thank you, Ms. Gleason. Mr. Nelson?
Good afternoon, I'm Paul Nelson. I'm the superintendent of schools in Kennesaw Parish, and I've been a superintendent in the state of Louisiana for 10 years. Mr. Castile has sort of paraphrased what I told him last night. And I became a school administrator in 1998, so I know I look like I'm only 30, but I've been around for a little bit. And so I've seen a lot of changes with accountability and graduation requirements during the time, as you can imagine. But one of the things that I shared with Mr. Castile was that when I first became an administrator, my superintendent told me, Paul, always remember, if you're going to make a mistake that favors the child. And so I've talked about that with my staff for years, and I believe it is so important for our conversation today. There will be folks who come before you this afternoon to tell you that you're making a mistake if you grant a waiver. I personally feel like the waiver is needed. I have about 10% of my graduating seniors who will not make it without this waiver. And Mr. Morris's question, 80% of the teachers in Kennesaw Parish are not certified. So when we talk about the numbers, and I know for some people these numbers are small, but it makes me think about the little boy who walked down the beach and was picking up starfish and throwing them back into the water. And there were literally thousands of starfish on the beach that day. And somebody asked him, why are you throwing those back? You can't throw them back. You can't throw them all back. He says, no, I can't. But I can throw this one back. And this one will make it because I threw it back in the water. So when you think about the decisions today, think about the children, the Ms. Bochet had some great points earlier, and I appreciate her bringing those to the floor. And I appreciate Dr. Buffy having this meeting today to bring this issue out for discussion. So thank you very much.
Mr. Baldwin?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to say thank you to the board as well, to Dr. Plumley, State Superintendent and staff, John Bowden, Superintendent of Schools in Assumption Parish. And I'm here today because I received an email. I received an email from one of our graduating seniors, well, potential graduating seniors. And she said to me, she said, Mr. Bowden, I'm struggling. I need help. If there's anything you can do, please do. I emailed her back, I said, I'll be on campus, let's take a look at your transcript, let's take a look at your graduation plan, let's take a look at the courses you are actually taking now, and see what we can do to possibly help you graduate. She's doing everything she possibly can. She's reporting to school every day. She is taking credit recovery courses. She's attending tutoring during the day, as well as after school. So I'm just here for her. If I can help one student, I think I've done a good job, because we all here for students. And if there's anything I can do for one child, I gave her my word. She's not here today, you know why? Because she is still working. So as far as accountability, as far as lowering our standards, I told her, I said, you continue to work. I'll try to do what I can on my end. And she's doing that. We are in the wee hours of the night. So as far as accountability is concerned, we've been holding our kids accountable all year. And at this point, we're getting ready to make a decision. So I just ask you to consider this item, consider taking our kids in your best interest, in your decision making. So I really appreciate you. Thank you to the board. Thank you to Dr. Brony. Thank you for everyone being here this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. Next three we have is Caleb Moore, Terence Lockett, and Dennis Stewart.
All right, thank you, Mr. President and members. My name is Caleb Moore, and I'm representing the American Federation for Children. The mission of this body is to provide leadership, create policies for education that expand opportunities for children, empower families and communities, and advance Louisiana in an increasingly competitive global market. That is taken directly off of BESE's website in the mission statement. Today I'm in opposition to this item because I fail to see how this helps to achieve any of the goals outlined in the mission of this board. Releasing these students into the workforce in higher education without proficient education is clearly against the goals of advancing Louisiana in an increasingly competitive global market and expanding opportunities for these children. This body has done great work recently building public trust, but I'm deeply concerned that this large decision with such little notice and time for discussion will hurt public trust in this process. That's been clear from the outpouring of comments online and to various stakeholders since this was reported publicly. I understand the importance of seeking out, ways that we can help these kids solutions to help these, issues prior to graduation. But I'm concerned that this issue, how it's surfaced only days ahead of graduation, with $4 billion in aid and intervention plans that were put in place to address this exact issue. Louisianans in this corner love to wonder how these are contributing to improving educational outcomes for their children. As others have noted and discussed, it appears that children this year are achieving outcomes somewhat comparable to those achieved in 2019 from early data. In some cases, we've actually seen areas improve scores. So I think there's still more data that needs to be considered with that. So making this decision now doesn't appear to be in the best interest of the data. This measure allows for substitution of ACT scores in place of the deep assessment. It would allow a composite score of 17 or higher, or a score of 17 or higher in correspondingly 2025 assessment. ACT places their benchmark on college readiness at 18 for math, 22 for math, 18 for English, 22 for math and reading, and 23 for science. Those scores represent the level of achievement required for students to have a 50% chance at obtaining a B or higher, or about 75% to 80% chance of obtaining a C or higher in corresponding credit-bearing courses. An ACT score of 17 does not represent a commitment to student academic excellence. If in the process of seeking more data, we find that these children are still lacking proficiency, the answer is to meet their needs with remediation. The answer is not to have them move out of our schools unprepared for an increasingly competitive global market. We should be focused on bringing these kids up, not our expectations down. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lockett.
Thank you. Good afternoon, board members. My name is Terence Lockett, and I am representing the Education Group on down. I'm not going to sit here and reiterate a lot of what my colleagues and others who have expressed some of the same thing, but I will simply ask to not grant this waiver. There is no data that supports this, and it's not warranted. I mean, likewise, what is the urgency for doing this at this late hour with graduation only 2 weeks ago? As the education policy body for the state, one could rightfully assume that you would have already known that there was a problem with large numbers of students and the potential for them not to graduate due to COVID, and that you would have taken action long before today. We sit in here month after month and have argued and debated many issues, such as lowering the ACT score and other issues of that nature, but never this. Now, this body has granted waivers in extraordinary situations, and then only to those parishes that were directly affected by those events. Oftentimes, that's the whole state. So what is the extraordinary situation in Caddo Parish that is shared by Plaquemine Parish? COVID should not be considered an extraordinary event. Students have been in classrooms since August of 2021. And to the best of my knowledge, there have not been a plethora until today of school superintendents coming to plead their cases before the body to request a waiver. Data points to students doing just as well this year as they did prior to the pandemic. Now clearly, districts have been doing their job, working to maintain and improve the outcomes of students. And I applaud you. I applaud them, as you should also, all the parties that have worked extremely hard to address the learning losses caused by COVID. Now, students not being able to graduate for various reasons is not a new phenomenon. And there are policies in place to address when these situations occur. Schools and students work extremely hard to meet the requirements that are placed on them for success. Why do we need to do something different this time around? Dr. Bofi, in her statement on this issue, stated that initially she did not want to entertain the idea of waiving requirements at the beginning of the year. Now it has changed. And I understand her reasons for the change of heart. I feel for the student that she highlighted. Likewise, I understand Ms. Beauche's statement that these kids have been operating under a handicap. The superintendent of Concordia Parish just stated that the class of 2022 is tenacious and resilient, and a host of other adjectives to describe this class. I wholeheartedly agree with that assessment of them. However, none of this should negate the work of students around the state who have worked extremely hard, given as it was stated handicaps, to meet the requirements for graduation as set by this board. Once again, I ask you, I urge you not to grant a waiver to the entire state for graduation requirements. It is a slap in the face of the students and parents who have worked hard to meet the requirements that you as a body have set for them. And if the requirements are too stringent, then maybe we should settle for something different. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Stewart?
I want to thank each of you for this time to speak. And I'm here on behalf of I'm Dennis Stewart, principal of Peabody Magnet High School in Northeast Parish, and I'm here on behalf of our superintendent, Jeff Powell. I'm going to say that I am in the trenches right now, and I'm exhausted. And when we went through COVID, I was at a middle school, and I remember it like yesterday. It was difficult then, and it's difficult now, transferring into a high school, low-performing high school, and trying to really work with our students. And I came in with 95 having to have that test passed. And we put our gloves on, raised up, and dug in to get these kids past this exam. We got it down to numbers in the teens. from 95 students. And I took on this school this year. I want you to think about the Golden Girls. We remember the Golden Girls? Sophia, picture it. Picture it, March 2020. Sophomore, you have a sophomore in your household, your children. So you have to put yourself in that position for you to get it. Your child has to take the biology, English 2 geometry exam. School's closed. It's over. All of us are in a panic. We don't know what's happening. All they know is we're not going to school anymore. We're excited about that. Junior year, chaos, virtual, brick and mortar students, long-term subs. Everybody had anxiety is up. COVID had students in and out of school. Home environments were horrible. Some raising themselves. Difficulty learning virtually. If it was your child. Principals and teachers have been in the trenches keeping our heads, trying to keep our heads above water. Rapides Parish used state, federal dollars remediating these students. And yes, the district had it down to 50 students left. So how do we look at it? Do we look at the ones we brought over to the other side? Or do we have grace and mercy and look at the 50 that we are leaving behind and they struggle? They don't even understand the impact this is going to have for years to come. So I know I'm speaking from the principal's standpoint. I'm not making the big money, and I'm not in the perfect school, but I believe that all principals and teachers bust their butt across this state to weather the storm in what we've had. And I'm still trying to understand it. But what do? We keep fighting every day to make changes. And I've sat here and listened, and most of you, I'm hearing some great things from you. So let's help bring our students out of this and start fresh next year. Thank you.
Thank you. The next three speakers will be Wes Watts, Aaron Bindley, and Dr. Patty Glazer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Board, and I appreciate the opportunity for this discussion. It's been robust and interesting. I am here in support of this waiver, and I'll share a couple reasons why. But first, I'd like to address the issue of the money. And I would just tell you, first I'd like to address the issue of success. We have very few students that fall into this category, very few. I think our schools, our teachers, our school leaders have done an amazing job in getting our students to the point that they are, which is why our numbers are close to the pre-COVID numbers, because of the work that they've done. Part of that is because of the money that we have been provided. We've used strategically, we've used it well, we've planned well to provide interventions and tutoring and support for our students so they can get to this point. I'm here because, not because of the number of students that we have, but I called our high school counselors about where we were on this situation. And in talking to them, they absolutely felt like we had 3 students that were directly impacted by COVID. They've done everything else they possibly could. We do have a couple of others that fall in this category that may not have. And I will tell you this because I say about our high school counselors are the best of the best. They hold our students accountable, they push them, they challenge them, they follow them, and they are for holding them up to standards and not allowing them to graduate when they don't deserve it. They told me directly they felt like we had a couple of these students that were directly impacted by COVID that prevented them from meeting these requirements. That's why I'm here. And for the fact, I would just say this also, I want to reiterate the fact that we've used our money wisely, the money that we've been provided. We've used it to train our teachers to support our students. And I go back to what you said, Mr. Castillo, that if we're going to err on the side of students. And I think this gives us an opportunity to do that. I would even propose this. I may not be speaking for all superintendents on it, but I won't be around much longer, so maybe I can say this now. I would propose that we support this waiver, but don't allow these students, if they don't pass that test, to count for SBS. This isn't about accountability. This is about these students and the work they've done and about their future. And if we don't need them to count in the accountability system for the school performance score or the district performance score, that's fine by me and my district. This is about the students that are in this situation. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Bindley.
Thank you, Mr. President and members of the board. My name is Aaron Bindley with the Pelican Institute for Public Policy, here in opposition to the statewide waiver that's been proposed for graduation requirements. This started out as a discussion about COVID. That this is a challenge specifically because of COVID, but I feel like for the past hour and a half, we've gotten to a point where at times it has sounded like we're questioning or possibly reconsidering graduation requirements altogether related to our state assessments. We talked about the fact that since the very beginning of these requirements, we have had numbers of students who have not met that requirement. And apparently no matter what we do and no matter how much money we have, we will always have students who will face challenges and not meet our requirements. We've also talked a lot today about passing tests. We use that word, pass. We've talked about success and success rates. But I want to bring us back to what the standard is for graduation. It's not mastery. It is not being what we typically refer to as on grade level. It's not proficiency. We're talking about an approaching basic level. That is an incredibly low expectation. 2 full achievement levels below proficiency, just 1 level up from unsatisfactory. That is the standard that we are talking about. We're talking about giving a high school diploma to students who scored unsatisfactory and claiming that as success. High school graduation is a milestone. It does signal something. Superintendent Boucher, it does certify to the public that these students have completed a milestone, that they're ready for college, hopefully ready without having to go in and take a year of remedial courses. It is certifying to them, their families, the public, to their employers, that they are college and career ready. We use that phrase a lot. That is what we're telling these students and telling the public when we grant a student a diploma. If they are not passing these tests, if they are scoring unsatisfactory, I would argue even if they are scoring approaching basic, we're not being truthful. We're lying to them. We're lying to their parents, to the colleges that they're going to their employers, to the public, saying that they are college and career ready when they are not. That is a travesty. One of the things that I've long respected about this board is that you don't make policy decisions in a rushed manner, and you don't do it without all of the data and all of the facts. We have a lot of facts that have just not been discussed today that we don't have. We've heard some general discussion about how $4 billion in federal recovery funds have been spent. Some of what some students have attempted. We don't know how many of these 2,400 students have actually received the minimum requirement of 30 hours of remediation in the subject in which they did not pass or met an approaching basic on their test. We don't know how many took credit recovery. We don't know what their senior year schedules were like if they took a full load. I think history would tell us they probably didn't. We don't know how many of these specific students benefited from the interventions, the tutoring, all of the efforts funded by these new federal funds. We need that information. I also want to know, and Dr. Bugby, I'm very happy for the student that you described who's been able to earn a technical diploma. That is not an easy thing to accomplish. I'd like to know how we have students who are able to earn a technical diploma from a community college that can't score an approaching basic on an end of course test. I think we need to look into that. You know, I did something last night that I usually try not to do, which is to read the comments on social media below the newspaper article. But I decided to take a look just to see what people thought. To my surprise, not one person supported this proposed change. 2 things that really struck me. One person said, so now high school diplomas are the new participation trophies. Is that what we're doing? Another person said, social promotion at its finest. We have to stop making excuses. We can't just say one more year, just one more time. You know how many times we've heard that? enough. Let's get back to the work of truly educating our students so that we can truthfully say that they are college and career ready. We need to be talking about raising the standard, not lowering it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fenderwood. Dr. BESE.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm Dr. Patty Glazer, County Head of Discovery Schools. Thank you, Dr. Buffy, for bringing attention to this matter, and thank you to the board for the really robust conversation, attempting to understand the nuances, because I think there are so many nuances to this issue. I am here in support of a solution for these 2022 students. This is not about a long-term accountability request. This is not about an SPS score for a particular school. This is about a group of students that were impacted by events that happened in their sophomore year that were beyond their control. Kenner Discovery is a B academic index and A growth index. Our 2019 subgroup performance is very good for economically disadvantaged students of color and students with disabilities, all in the 77th percentile. Our ELL subgroup performance is good at the 60th percentile. Kenner Discovery's particular issue is mainly with the biology versus U.S. history tests, which have been discussed at length. Our principal, Candace Schott, who will speak today, has detailed data about the issue. Some of it has been said already by the board members. This seems to impact the ELL population the most. For us, it has not impacted a single gen ed student at Discovery. All of our impacted students are 504 and ELL students. There seems to be an equity issue here. Our graduation rate is 97%. We plan as if each student will graduate. We use Escrow Funds strategically for remediation during and after school hours to support student academic growth from kindergarten through 12th grade. Yet we still have 12 students of our 151, 7.9%, that will not graduate and will not benefit from an additional year of high school. Potentially, we're likely to create more dropouts if we don't come up with a creative solution. Mr. Castile, I appreciate you looking for the balance of this potential solution, and I challenge the BESE members to find a solution for these students this year in this situation. Thank you for your work.
Thank you, Ms. Glazer. Our next three speakers will be Candace Schott, Millie Harris, and Bridget Nealon.
I'm Candace. Hi, Candace Schott, principal of Kenner Discovery High School. Thank you so much for having me today and having this conversation. It just so happened yesterday afternoon, I spoke to Dr. Glazer. She noticed I looked tired. It was because I had spoken personally with the 12 students one by one to let them know that they had not passed the U.S. history again for the fourth time yesterday. I had those conversations. And so I was happy to hear that this was happening today and happy to be able to be here. I'm speaking in favor of a waiver specifically for the U.S. history and biology requirement for the class of 2022. Some of these stats were already shared, but I'm another person. So the 2021 U.S. history failure rate was 32%. It's the highest failure rate of any test in any year. The biology failure rate was 20% in its worst year, which was 2021. Most Louisiana seniors were taking biology in 2020 and U.S. history in 2021. With a 32% failure rate, approximately 14,000 students went into their senior year this year not meeting their LEAP requirements. We usually try to get that out of the way before they hit senior year. This most significantly impacted the ELL students, as Dr. Glazer mentioned. 69% of the state's ELL students earned an unsat on U.S. history, 69%. Any educator knows that when 69% of anybody fails something, there's a problem. Those students learned language through immersion. The opportunity for immersion was taken away from them, and they received very little immersion for 18 months. There was a lot of hybrid learning, there was a lot of at-home time. This certainly impacted their ability to access language.
Personally, as I said, we have 12 students, which is 8% of our senior class, who are missing that check in the box of U.S. history or biology. They're all either ELL or 504. They have all passed their math and ELA leap. One particular EL student, who was voted the most likely to put a smile on your face, came to us as a sophomore with very little English. He's passed all his classes. He's earned a silver on the working use assessment, a test that requires significant analytical skills and a tidbit in English. He passed the leap for ELA, he passed the leap for math. But for some reason, the passing score for the U.S. history is a 711, the highest benchmark score of all tests, with ELA and math being a 700. The student scored a 706. If the U.S. history benchmark was 700, as it is for ELA and for math, 10 of my 12 students would check the box. Now, I didn't make the test and I wasn't part of that, so I'm not sure why it's a 711 versus a 700 as it is for the others. But our passing rate would be much closer to what's been in previous years if it were in line with the other tests. We've already recognized that we need to revamp the U.S. history test as evidenced by the pending change to civics. We all agree that there have to be standards of learning. And like in 2021, I'm happy to hold students to the standards of the waiver that was issued last year. I'm not asking for unqualified, unprepared students to be allowed to graduate. I'm asking for students who have passed their required classes and met the requirements aligned to last year's waiver to be allowed to graduate and receive their diploma. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Harris? Ms. Nealon?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Bessie members, good afternoon, and I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today. I'm Bridget Nealon with Stand for Children, Louisiana, and I'm here in opposition to the proposal to waive graduation requirements for this school year. Stand's opposition is based primarily on our belief in and commitment to transparency and accountability in education, but I'll briefly note a few specific objections to the proposal. First, procedurally. This is a hastily called meeting with little to no available data to support the need for something as important as waiving graduation requirements. For example, how many students in each school district would be impacted if this waiver was to be adopted? How many of them have remediation and retook the test? What interventions or appraisals were in place? Further, you're considering the item as a notice of intent with an emergency adoption. The seniors the proposal appears to impact most today began their academic challenges as sophomores. School districts have had 2 years of opportunities to remediate these students to an approaching basic level, and that remediation is required in your policy. Remediation that is further supported by the $4 billion plus in Escrow Funds that were sent to the state to address learning loss that occurred due to the pandemic. Finally, graduation ceremony dates have been on school calendars for months. None of the issues being discussed today seem to rise to the level as any type of emergency. The next issue is how this impacts the legislature. We're currently in legislative session, as you all know. They are considering the $4 billion plus MFP resolution that BESE created and sent to them. This year's resolution includes an additional $200 million in teacher and staff salary increases. Approving this proposal without a statewide declaration of emergency that would include, or could include, massive loss of property that could occur in natural disasters, and no data showing that overall performance this year is substantially worse than pre-COVID levels, could send a negative message that, even with time and a once-in-a-lifetime gift of resources, BESE is unwilling to maintain a graduation performance standard at even a minimum level of approaching basic. This message could potentially have a negative impact on pay raise and other important funding contained in this new MFP. Another issue that also involves the legislature is the ability to substitute courses if a student makes an ACT score of 17. The legislature has repeatedly rejected a 17 as the desired level of ACT attainment. They did so last week, and many of us opposing the proposal today were at the legislature opposing that bill. I understand this is a controversial issue, but 18 is the current desired score, and this proposal will eliminate years of data and debate in one single motion. This is a dangerous precedent. This year, we're dealing with one cohort of students who are impacted by COVID, but every student was impacted. Will next year's proposal be based on the fact that the freshmen of 2019 were stressed? Will future years, the waivers be based on the fact that third graders from 2019 missed too much school to learn to read properly? We understand not allowing a student to graduate because he or she has not met requirements. It's a difficult and emotional issue for everyone involved. I only wish that that same level of emotion and need for a call to action would have been present over the last 2 years as caring educators work with these struggling students to help them get prepared for meeting all of the very minimal requirements it takes to receive a diploma in Louisiana. Thank you for your time. I ask that you stand for the students of Louisiana today, students who may not get the services they need as bureaucracies increasingly become dependent upon waivers and a hold harmless status and defeat this proposal today. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Harris.
Good afternoon, I'm Millie Harris, Executive Director of JCFA, non-traditional alternative charter schools in the greater New Orleans area and in Lafayette. I wanted to provide you all with a little information because I have a very hard time sitting at the table saying that I'm in opposition to an alternative pathway for students to earn a high school diploma. But the more I sit here, the more I fall in opposition to what's being proposed. 3% of the students who were enrolled at JCFA schools on 10-1 were murdered this year. 30% of my students have been incarcerated for more than 3 days. 15% have parents, at least one, who is currently incarcerated. 10% of my students are teen parents, new teen parents this year. 100% of my students were impacted by COVID. Students have individual trauma each and every year. JCFA uniquely serves students who don't pass the LEAP every year. My average student is an 18-year-old sophomore. Every year, some of the 4% who don't pass the LEAP enroll at my school just for test prep. I'm not paid MFP for them. They don't benefit my SPS score. I serve them, I support them, I graduate them. It's hard to say that I don't want another pathway for students to graduate, because that is what I do. But I look at all of my students, and I'm unique. This will not impact any student I serve. None of my students will miss graduation because they can't pass the test. We start test prep October 1st for 2 months ahead of the fall test window. 2 hours a week, every week. We start February 1st for the spring test window. We're starting this week for the June test window. Our students don't get the benefit of a waiver. If they don't pass that test, they don't graduate year in and year out. In the 18-19 academic year, 99% of my students passed the U.S. history test. In 2021, 94%. So yeah, we saw a dip, but it's not okay. I can't not let my students pass the test. They have to pass the test. They come to JCFA to pass the test. If I tell students this year, it's okay, what do I say to the rest of my students every year? A student who was in 8th grade in 1920 and dealt with the pandemic was virtual as a freshman in 2021, and if they were in Jefferson Parish, didn't start their high school time this year until October 1st. Those students are going to be dramatically impacted by the impacts of COVID for well beyond this year. The waiver, I appreciate it, but I don't think it's what our students or our districts need. We need accountability and support for students and better opportunities and options and pathways to graduation all the time, not just in the spur of the moment because of the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Harris. Our next three speakers will be Caroline Romer, Julia Williams, and Jennifer Bouquet.
Good afternoon, Caroline Romer, Louisiana Association of Public Charter Schools. Most of you know I've been coming to this table for a very long time, and I'm not a big fan of information card points only. I like to be in the red or in the green. But today I am here as a point of information. You have heard from two members of LAPCS with opposing opinions on what to do in this case, and that is the case across our membership. I have literally received numerous emails representing different sides of this issue. I've had some cohort of high school principals in the greater New Orleans area sent you a letter dating back to January, talking about the struggles and challenges they were having with special populations, specifically ELL, who really would like to see this waiver. I've had an email from a North Louisiana charter school very opposed to it. His opinion being, we've been working our bleep off. We're very proud of what we've accomplished, and we want our scores to count. We believe in what we're doing, and we want to move forward. I've had others write who say, well, I'm overseeing a K-8 school. If there's a problem at the high school level, which they believe already has an easier accountability system than they do, they're like, then why aren't you talking about all students right now? Why is it just this group of students? So we've seen the gamut. There is not an agreement. And so LAPCS cannot come to the table with a position on this issue today. However, what our membership does agree on is that this waiver is solving something for 1 year for one group of students. We have many more challenges that require a lot of innovation and creative solution and solving for those problems, whether it's truancy, whether it's mental health, whether it's nutrition programs, after-school programs. What our membership would tell you is we have lots of challenges. This is a one-time thing, and we're asking this board and this department to work with us on all of those other things, teacher retention, teacher recruiting, many, many more problems than what we've talked about here today. I would also just footnote, and this is a specific to charter schools. You know, I've also always come to the table and talked about being consistent with, when you make a policy, support that policy, be consistent in your decision making. I would just put on the table, as you move forward on this, remember charter schools who are held to a standard that includes not being renewed in their operating agreement, if they do not meet those standards, will be in front of you, a set of them in December. And they will remember this waiver and they will want to know, so why did you have a waiver for a certain set of students, but now here I am today and you're potentially not renewing my school? So I would say think about those things, and again, we're going to seek consistency in how you make decisions and how you judge performance of schools. What we really want, tell us what the standard is, tell us what the expectation is, provide public schools with the resources they need to do the work, and frankly, get out of the way with your prescriptive directives on how to do it. As charter schools, we want to make decisions as close to students as possible, using the most innovative methods we can do so. And so some of these challenges could be, we think, addressed if you let us do it and you not tell us how to do it. Thank you.
Mr. Garvey, I have a question for her.
Ms. Bowman.
Ms. Romer, thank you. What makes people think their scores won't count? Because, and let me just preface this by saying, I think this needs to be split in two, right? My intention is to have a conversation about students who are approaching graduation. That's a different conversation than our SPS and our accountability system. I'm glad they worked their tails off. I wanted them to work their tails off, and I'm proud of the success of the students and the educators who've been able to meet that mark, and I don't want to take anything away from anyone. So I'm not quite sure where the accountability part is coming from, and I think we've got to figure out, help me understand why they think their scores won't count.
I can give, it's a very specific circumstance. So the score part is your graduating students that may not have otherwise graduated, that impacts, what is it, the cohort score?
Cohort graduation,
all that sort of thing. And so, I won't name names, but this particular charter school is in a place where they're saying they can't enroll more students into their school because of the agreement they have with their local authorizer related to SPS scores. So if this is one of those years of an asterisk or that changes the opportunity children are given to attend the charter school, I don't know if I feel like you're understanding what I'm saying.
I see what you're saying, but my intention for being at this meeting today is to talk about the students in the class of 2022. I am not here, my intention wasn't to talk about school performance scores, although I did take a minute break and I understand that there are other people who are interested in talking about school performance scores. And,
maybe it's just not clear to them, Dr. Watt.
Okay, so I hope that I'm making it clear now. The point in my mind is to talk about the students in the class of 2022, not to talk about the 21-22 school performance scores.
I think that, again, many think that whether this is about that group of students, there could be, again, a confusion on what that means for SPS and how that would impact them. But there are others that say, okay, you're talking about this one group of kids, but what happens when we come in December with another group of kids that have a challenge? So
I know, I get it, and I understand that. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, before we go to the next speaker, I have one question. The motion that we have on the floor right now does not involve graduation or SPS and how waivers would affect SPS. It's just a motion to discuss, correct? Okay, so at any point in time that someone changes the motion that's on the floor, they may want to address this SPS issue and the accountability implications of what any waiver might create. Ms. Williams?
Thank you. Good morning, or good afternoon. My name is Julia Williams. I'm the principal at Northside High School in Lafayette Parish. And I very much appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation today. Many of you have brought up many wonderful points, and I am here in support of this discussion or motion. So just to celebrate, I'm the principal of a very small school. We have about 100 students, seniors this year. And I started the year with over a third of them at risk of not graduating solely because of exams. And the majority of those 35 students was specifically the U.S. history exam. And so the point that I want to continue to drive home is the inequity that we're looking at this year. And that's the fact that the majority of these students took biology, were exempt from it, and then now, 2 years or over 2 years later, we're given the expectation that they pass the U.S. history, which they've been unsuccessful in multiple times. Or, like I'm sure many other administrators, we've given them the biology test after lots of remediation multiple years later, hoping that they'll pass that, and they didn't get the opportunity to do that the first time around. The other inequity that we're seeing here is that we will graduate students. I have students in the other 65 who are graduating this year without the expectation of meeting that expectation because they earned the waiver 3 years ago. So they were exempt from biology and U.S. history because by luck of scheduling, they were in those classes. The other same similar situation is if they were in algebra that year and then they've chosen the Jumpstart pathway, they don't have to take geometry. So that's no longer part of that graduation expectation because they were exempt from algebra. So it's inequitable, and we can't have a conversation about making sure that we're only graduating students who pass these tests because not all of them will have had to pass these tests. So I think it's very inequitable that we have me right now 4 students that we're having this conversation about when some of their peers are going to walk across that stage without ever having had to pass those tests. The other piece that I would like to bring up is the high number of uncertified teachers we have right now. And so the number of students that we have that are sitting in classrooms that are either with long-term substitutes, uncertified teachers, or in my case, I have 4 classes being taught virtually through a hired program. And so not everybody's receiving equitable instruction, and this may be the situation some of my students are in as they're preparing for these tests that they're taking for the 3rd and 4th time. When we talk about data, I do think you can still pull the data and look at how our schools are performing and how our teachers are doing. We're here today talking about our individual students. And then as I watch the time count down, I think the last thing I really want to bring up is we all know that COVID has hit our lower socioeconomic population more than any other population. And I think if we pulled the data, we would see that we're talking about those same students, our lower socioeconomic students. So therefore, it's just one more barrier we put in place for those students, when what we need to do is be advocating on how to remove barriers so that they can be successful in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Lockett?
Thank you. Hello, hi, my name is Jennifer Lockett. I'm a counselor at Lafayette High School in Lafayette, Louisiana. And I'm here today to talk to you about this proposal. I'm in support of this proposal. At the beginning of this school year in July, after summer testing, I encouraged all my kids to go to summer testing, and of everyone who went to summer testing, only 2 passed the U.S. history test when they took it the 2nd time. So I started out the school year with 97 students who needed to pass a lead test. That is the most I've ever had. I've never had that many. And this is my 14th year in education. And I called my BESE board member, I called the state, I called my district. This is not last minute. The people in the trenches have been raising the alarm since July. And then we did remediation through a 30-minute block every day since the day we returned from Labor Day. Every day, these kids were placed in remediation based on which test we felt they would have the best chance of passing, based off of a previous score if we had one, or just pure luck, biology. And they did that. We put them in online tutoring programs. And then they tested again in December. And at that point, many of them passed because we offered them both the U.S. history and the biology test. And I was left with only 36 after that testing cycle that needed to pass the test in order to graduate. And now we have still done the remediation, placed them now that we had both scores in the appropriate remediation for what we felt they had the best chance of passing. We've also offered after-school tutoring via in-person, and I've had some kids who have jobs, so we also had the teacher do it via Zoom. I had one who was a fry cook who would have his phone sitting there while the teacher is teaching biology and flipping through Zoom. And I'm now down to 11. And that is over 22% down to 2.5%. Our teachers have worked hard. Our kids have worked hard. This is not a reflection on either one of them. This is a reflection of something that is outside of their control. And I feel like as an organization that is always looking in the best interest of our children, we should consider a waiver for this year. And yes, every student has been impacted, but every student has more time. These students were dismissed in March. 2 years of instruction in biology was lost. We were hybrid last year, every other day on quarantining and teachers quarantining and everything like that. They didn't have a normal year. And this year, we still had quarantining. 3 of my biology spots is being taught by teachers with no credential. They're long-term subs because our teachers were hired by the hospitals and taken out of our system. Sorry, my time is up. Thank you.
Yes.
Mayor, I'd like to ask you a question. As an educator, can you tell me how it makes you feel to have the work that you have done this year described as lacking a sense of urgency?
It's frustrating that people are saying this is so last minute. I mean, I have emails like since July. It's 97. Usually we start off the year with maybe 30. You know, and I am an EL school. Our kids get shipped over the entire district to my school who are considered EL. And 30 is usually the highest we've had. So I knew from July that this was going to be a concern. And our district provided in-person leap remediation and over the summer, especially to our EL population. I'm going to say this, of the 11 that's left, only 3 are EL. You know, like we have worked hard with them to get those kids. It's my regular ed and 504 students actually that are the majority of them. And let me explain, of the 11, 2 of them are not going to graduate because they don't pass the classes. And that's fine. That's how we know these kids aren't ready. They're not doing the work, they're not putting in the effort. They will not graduate. This waiver's not going to do anything for them. They're not going to graduate. You know? I had a kid who I had to beg to come to school. I went and picked him up on the last day in December. He came and he took 45 minutes and passed the test. And I've had another girl who has gone every single day to remediation, stayed after school, done the online tutoring, and has a 3.2 GPA. She works so hard, he will not graduate. And so when I have a kid sitting next to another kid, I don't think it's equitable even with the test. So
I appreciate your hard work. Thank you so much.
Okay. Our next 3 speakers will be Jennifer Underpont, Francis Touchette, and Barry Irwin. Mr. Touchette is waving. Okay, we will go with our other 2 speakers.
Good afternoon. I am Jennifer Underpont. I am a counselor at Acadiana High School in Lafayette. I just want to start by saying that I'm very old school. In fact, like, these are my notes. So, like, I am old school. I do believe in standards. This is my 32nd year and my last year in education and my 22nd year as a school counselor. These kids, these seniors, have been and are at a disadvantage. Hands down. They are at the same disadvantage as the kids last year and the year before. Okay? They are. It is heartbreaking to have to tell these kids that they are not graduating. At Acadiana High, we started the year with 109 students needing leave to graduate. 109 seniors. We have 370 seniors. 109 of them needed leave. We are down right now. We have 5 who have not passed for sure, and we still have 7 whose scores are pending. Out of those 5, we have 2 who have passed workies, who have earned a silver on workies. One of those students is going to be a mother any day now. If she does not get this waiver, she cannot attend summer school for remediation. And we know, those of us who have kids who haven't graduated before, because it is very difficult to find them again. Their numbers are never the same. They disappear. It is so hard to get them back. That child has earned all of her IBCs. She has passed all of her classes. Okay? We have another student who is a TOPS University student. He is a 20 on his ACT, not a 17, not an 18. This child has a 20 on his ACT. He has signed to go play football at Coffeyville Community College in Kansas. He had to call his coach and tell him that he's not graduating, because we've already told the kids that they're not graduating. And now there's talks of getting his high set. And this child was a 20 on his ACT and has met all top university requirements, is going to leave without a high school diploma. I know it's late. Our kids start, our seniors start exams next week, and I know some districts are graduating right now. But I tell you what, I don't know one of these 5 parents that would not welcome the phone call at this point to say there's an opportunity for your child to graduate. That's the phone call that we do want to make.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Irwin. Thank you. I'm Barry Irwin, President of Council for a Better Louisiana, and just wanted to start off by thanking you for the work that you have done for so many years in terms of standards, high expectations for our students, and sending the message that those things are important, and they are important to the students, but important to our state as well. I also want to be very thankful to the numbers of teachers and educators, principals who have done wonderful work during what are certainly extremely challenging circumstances, and we appreciate that very much too. I just want to touch on a couple of things that have been brought up before, and I will let you go. We talked a lot about COVID, but I think really part of the discussion to me that we really need to focus on is what does the diploma mean? What is its value? What do we say is important about it? Because if we believe, theoretically we do, that that is the measure, the credential that our students need to achieve success at the next level, to go on to college, to a community college, a technical college, other training, a career, if we believe that is the credential they need, then we ought to be honest about that, and that passing those tests and those things are important. I think, Mr. Castillo, you brought up the question or the point from the superintendent about erring on the side of our students. I think by giving a credential that we think is important to a student that hasn't necessarily earned it or been able to reach that level that we say is important for success is not really being helpful or erring on the side of students. And I think, Ms. Holloway, you brought up the question, which I think is pretty valid, about if we provide this waiver at this time, does that mean that we're not going to be doing things for those students on the back end in terms of remediation and that? That's a real concern. I think the issue is not just so much do we provide this waiver because this has been a very challenging time for so many students and teachers. It's what are we doing to make sure that this credential that we think is important, that we get our kids to the level where they can succeed later on. Otherwise, we'll just be passing them on to colleges for them to do the remediation at a cost to the students that they wouldn't have otherwise, or passing them on to an employer where they'll have to do some of the same thing. So those are our concerns. I know it's a very difficult decision to be making at this time, but we would hope you would take that into consideration and reconsider about whether going forward with this waiver. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And our final two speakers are Mark Rabelais and Irma Trosclair. Mark Waves, thank you, and Irma Trosclair.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Irma Trosclair, Superintendent of the Lafayette Parish School System, and I thank you for this discussion, and I thank you for the opportunity to speak to you briefly this afternoon. This is my 39th year in education. I've had the distinct honor and pleasure of serving as a principal at 3 different schools in 3 different districts. All of those schools were high poverty schools, disadvantaged students. And I say all of that to say that I believe in accountability. We turn schools around because we set high expectations in all 3 of those schools. We didn't let kids off the hook for learning or for the responsibility of giving their best. But I also focused and asked that we focus on opportunity gaps for children. Because ahead of academic gaps are always opportunity gaps. And in my 39 years as an educator, I've not seen a larger, greater opportunity gap than I've seen because of this pandemic. Our students, the seniors that we're talking about right now, have missed out on 75% of their high school education. It's been disrupted. We talk about the last 2 years. I've heard other folks from the public comment about the fact that we've had 2 years to recover. We've not had 2 uninterrupted years. Our ESSER's money, our federal money, we have focused on student academic recovery, social and emotional needs. We have made that a priority for our students. Even our remediation efforts, after school tutoring, we provided transportation to those students who would otherwise not be able to participate in those. We've done everything we possibly can to make sure students had every opportunity to be successful. But those efforts were interrupted as well. We, in January and February, as recent as this January and February, we were still closing classrooms down because of positive cases and because of quarantines. We had, and thankfully, we have great people. We actually had classes being covered, talking about 25 students. We're set to graduate approximately 2,400. The waiver that we're asking for these 25 students will not allow every Lafayette senior to graduate. We're not trying to water down accountability. We're not trying to let kids off the hook for learning. We will still have seniors in our district that will not graduate because they have not met the other requirements. We're talking about a group of students who have different standards than some of the same kids in their cohort. And I appreciate what Ms. Holloway said earlier about what message will that send to students who did pass. I'm going to ask that you all consider the message that it sends to this group of students when they see their classmate walking across the stage and that person, because of the luck of the draw scheduling in their sophomore year, has absolutely no requirement for this particular test. What message is that to this particular group of students? I ask that you consider and you do err on the side of children. I ask that you consider the fact that for 75% of their high school career, they have had interrupted learning. They have not had equitable access, equitable opportunities to teaching and learning. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Mr. Members, that concludes our public comment. Do we have any comments or questions from BESE members? Ms. Bopey.
I'd like to hear the board's concise response to a point that I think was brought up earlier about the accountability component of this. So it seems like my intention was to talk about students and talk about students graduating. It seems like in some people's minds this also is connected to accountability, and I believe that's because we have a graduation rate that is a component of our accountability system, so they're naturally connected. So I am curious to hear where board members are on that particular point. So let's say we agree to graduate students, right? Let's say we agree to graduate the students if certain conditions are met, and I would propose those certain conditions should be similar to the conditions that were put in place last year. The ACT composite of a 17 on the subject area that we're talking about, 20 additional hours of learning. Is there any of them that I'm missing in here?
Those are, by the way, those are being proposed in these current policies.
Okay. Was work keys included in the LaFouche waiver? Was work keys included as one of the components of the LaFouche waiver? Because I don't see work keys on here. Anyway, I'll have you guys look at that one. So that's one piece, okay?
Because that's the non-public.
Oh, I'm looking at the wrong one,
You're
sorry.
not going to see it in
Okay.
741 because we only underlined what we were changing. But basically it's doing the same thing they did.
Okay, so do the same thing we did last year and extend this to the class of 2022, right? So that is what I ultimately want to do today. For anybody who's interested in where I want to be, that's what I ultimately want to do today. So I want to make a motion to that effect, and I want to make it emergency rule, which emergency rule for our board means it could go into effect right away. So that's my interest. What I want to discuss is whether or not we also say these students didn't make the actual graduation requirements as we had set up previously in the bulletin. So when it comes time to do the school performance scores, we are going to exclude those students from those school performance scores. And that's where I would like to hear where my board members are, because I've got to decide if I wrap that into this motion or not.
Yeah, we have some information on this issue from the department. Would you like to hear that first?
It is very concise.
Well, Ms. Holloway.
Yeah, I want to
to make a comment.
About your question. I think what's happening here, the confusion that we're all sensing, is because we have no data and there has been no discussion about this prior to, so maybe that's where the lack of information is coming in. Possibly.
The federal requirements around accountability require us to use the cohort grad rate in our formula. We can't modify it for these purposes. So if the students are awarded the same diploma that the preponderance of students in the state are awarded, then they go in the numerator. We can't differentiate. They're either in the denominator, in the numerator, or they're not, and they're in the numerator if they've earned the same diploma that everyone else has earned. So unless we are calling this a different diploma, then they have to be in the numerator.
Thank you for helping. That answers my question in terms of the way that I'm going to propose this motion. I appreciate you. I love the conciseness. Okay, so I propose that we adopt emergency rules to reflect the same substitutions in place for the 2020 and 2020-2021 years. Oh, and I got a second.
Second by Dr. Davis. Do we have any comments and questions or questions from BESE members?
I have a question.
Yes, sir. Mr. Castillo.
So I do remain a little bit concerned about the standards and SPS. So and I don't want to muddy the water. But in the past, we've got waivers from the federal government as it relates to how we account for. Is there a way to do that as well?
There are certain things that they can't waive that are not within the authority, and every conversation I've ever had with them around graduation rate was not one of those areas where there was any kind of flexibility. It's called out very specifically in the law. Places where they have some flexibility is the percentage and amount that you, how you interpret certain elements of the law. This is a very specific thing in the law.
Okay, other BESE members? Ms. Holloway.
I'm struggling with this decision and information coming forward. I need clarity.
Can I ask you, in light, when you say that, when you say you need information, how is the decision that we're making today different than the way we made this decision last year when we granted this waiver? We had the same set of information in front of us.
I don't have any information in front of me as far as the data, so for me to make this decision as a statewide waiver, that's what I'm struggling with because, because I feel that the lack of data before me, the lack of information that's coming in now, we're discussing school performance scores. In regards to statewide, I truly believe that this should be, and I believe in local control, look, accountability, the hard work that individuals are doing out there, that districts should have that autonomy to come forward to ask for a waiver. And so that's where I'm struggling with a statewide, because we've heard the pros and cons, we've had constituents send us information in regards to their opinions, also with the fairness of children, of students who have done their work, who've stayed the course, and that's what I'm struggling with.
I guess the disconnect for me and trying to figure out what the struggle is that we have the exact same issue this year as we had last year. And we made a statewide waiver, and it pertained to the exact same issues. We had the same numbers in front of us in terms of the kids that are failing as we did last year, and that for some reason we're unwilling to treat these students in an equitable manner and with the same level of compassion and appreciation for their experiences under COVID. But I'll just say that I have a child in my own home who missed 16 weeks of school for quarantine last year. That's not counting the days that he missed this year, and then also in a district that did not allow online learning when he was in quarantine this year. And so I just think that there is, I really would like to see us think about equity and think about compassion and to think about where our kids are.
Well, I'm not liking that.
I know, I'm not saying that at all, and I apologize if I implied that.
No, and we're just looking at another year of this. Yes, go ahead.
Ms. Voce and then Mr. Castillo.
I'm venturing to say that this graduating class was much more impacted than last year's. But to be perfectly honest, this year's graduating class, in my opinion, was much more impacted than last year's when we did this waiver last year. Last year, the class of 2021, they, as juniors, they were closed down. The only test that they, in a normal progression, may not have taken on economy for U.S. history, that they had to come back for, because all of their freshman and sophomore tests had been taken through 2019. This particular class, I think if we were all honest, we're looking at this data, and this data is telling us that this class is much more impacted than the class of 2019, much more so, in terms of these passage rates. When we looked at the data last year for 2021, it was not quite as impacted as this one is because of the situation of what year of school they were in. When we look at individual waivers, and I don't know if I'm going to get into trouble with all of this because we've got one coming up right after this, but when we look at a hurricane impact, we have legislation that says if you're out more than a certain number of days, you don't get the SPS score, and that has to do with SPS. You know, where those schools and school scores and district scores are impacted. But this year, a hurricane or an event that happens this year is not impacting districts as much as this whole COVID experience is on these particular children. I mean, if we're willing to waive for the hurricane impacted districts, and to me, my point is we're going to wait for one or two, we ought to wait for the 26 that were declared an emergency, because they were all impacted. But that was timed this year with coursework and in preparation for whatever test they're taking this year. So this particular class, I think if we are not, as some people have implied, watering down a curriculum. There are many business people, and I've talked to my business community. I went to my chamber, I've talked to my business council, they're in full support of this in the local level. Because they understand what we have been through over these past years, over these past 3 years, and what these kids have been through. We're not watering down curriculum. We're looking at the same waiver that we gave to kids last year who were less impacted in their entire high school career, if we want to put it that way. So we're not watering down. We're not saying that the high school diploma is not as valuable. The kids last year didn't quite make this. This is the last class that should be impacted, and all this stuff, oh, what are you going to ask for next year, whatever. That's, to me, not relevant. This is a COVID situation that has happened for 3 of the 4 years that these kids have been in school, and we've looked at the stats. We know how this data has impacted this class. The vast majority of them actually met the standard. And that is a testament to the students themselves, their families, their teachers, the administrators, and everyone involved. The struggling few who haven't, if we're honest with ourselves, if there's a percentage increase from 4 to 7, then that differential should be attributable to something. We're always going to have that 3 or 4% who aren't going to make it. We're not asking for waivers for them. But this differential has to be caused by something. And I think it's been very articulated as to what, very well articulated as to what has caused this and what these sophomores and juniors and now seniors have gone through. So I just implore everyone to take a look at this objectively and in your heart. Did the situation with COVID impact these kids for this period of time. And this is, to me, the last group that should have this brought before the board, for the BESE board in this type of request. We shouldn't hear about this anymore unless the world situation changes with this pandemic. But please, let's not penalize these kids, because we have seen the differential with the data. It is there.
I'm not sure about where the data is. All I heard was 7.9. I bet nothing.
4% to 7%.
Yeah.
That's a significant differential.
And also per district, like seeing the district stuff, but.
Well, I wouldn't even really want to see the districts, because if we're talking statewide, then that's a statewide impact. You know, I mean, my district is not going to be that, I'll be honest with you, that significantly impacted as a district. I'm looking at the kids. A score, I mean, it's not going to be that.
Any information from Superintendent Bradley about opinion, recommendation, what are you?
Let's come back to that for a second, to Mr. Castillo.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Thank you, Mr. President. My concern is that it's been a long time, but I remember being a child. And the thing that bothered me the most when I was a child is when I was treated unfairly. And that is, somehow I wasn't given a fair shake because of some misunderstanding by adults or some quirk in the system. So what concerns me about this issue is that because of the luck of the draw, that some students will walk across the stage and they will graduate because of the luck of the draw. And it's no fault of their own. And I'm concerned that when we make this decision, that we have a child whose life might be impacted forever. Because adults might not have all the appropriate information. We haven't gathered the data. We don't have all the perfect information at this moment in time that could impact that child. Like everyone, I'm concerned, and Dr. Finley said it extremely well, that perhaps as adults we need to change our system. Perhaps approaching basic isn't the right standard. Maybe that's not good enough for our Louisiana students, and that we need to look at perhaps overhauling our system. And the adults have a lot of work to do. But I think about Superintendent Nelson's comment earlier, and my assumption, Superintendent, I'm sorry I don't remember your name, but you're one student who said, go fight for me. I've done everything that I possibly can, and I need you to stand up and help me, because this is going to impact my entire life. If we're going to err, I'd rather err on the side of, well, we help the child. We help the child. We may get it wrong from a policy standpoint, but at the end of the day, we've got some children who are saying, I got a bad shake. This didn't go right because the adults didn't do something correct. They intended to do it right, but they got it wrong. And I'm going to be scarred for the rest of my life, perhaps by this decision. I don't want to water down standards, but I don't want to miss an opportunity to say even that one child in Assumption Parish, if we can. Therefore, Mr. Chairman, to say that one child and a few others, maybe not a whole lot, but a few others, I support the motion. And by the way, if my daughters have to continue walking, I'm going to leave in 10 minutes, so let's speed it up.
Okay, Mr. Morris, can you speed it up, please?
I'll try to speak up as best I can, Mr. Canfield, but I got a handful of notes here, so bear with me. So I have a little different perspective. I look at, first of all, it's all about the kids, right? It's all about the students. That's what we're here for. Number one priority, I think, for everybody. But then I ask myself, what are we charged with? And I did hear somebody, quote from the BESE website, and I share this with people all the time. Why do you serve on BESE? You don't get paid anything. There's no monetary value in it. It's not going to help your career. Like, John, I retired. So why do you serve on BESE, right? But if you go to the BESE website, what does it say? What does BESE do? BESE is charged with reaching every child in the state and best prepare them so that they can compete in ever competitively, I'm sorry, let me try to get it right, Mr. Castillo, in an increasingly competitively global economy. That's what the board is charged with, preparing kids to compete in an ever increasingly global economy. So in my mind, this is about preparation. Are we preparing kids to compete globally? That's what we're charged with. If we look at a college experience, did you graduate in 4 years? Did you graduate in 5 years? What difference does it make? Did you graduate? That's what counts. Did you leave college with the technical skills or whatever skills come with your degree so that you are prepared to go out and compete in an ever increasingly global economy? You're prepared. Did you do it in 4 years or 5 years? I don't know if it's that big a deal, but I'm prepared, right? So I don't understand what makes the high school experience any different, right? If we're saying that a D in biology, which looks like that's the biggest hurdle here, if we're saying that a D in biology is the biggest hurdle to a high school requirement in the state of Louisiana, is that big of a challenge to prepare kids for life? A D in biology to get through 4 years of high school, and you can't pass biology in 4 years. I served as a substitute, I shared that with you guys. It's an extremely challenging environment out there for teachers, for students, for parents, for everybody. I get that. But a D in biology, to me, that's doable. I was very impressed with the testimony from JCFA, some of the most challenging students in the state. But the opportunity is there, right? That's what education is. It's opportunity. You can take advantage of the opportunity or not. Does the opportunity exist? That's what's important. We heard her testimony. These are the most challenging students in the state. But they're taking advantage of the opportunity. They're showing it's doable. They check the box. They get their diploma. Then they have something to be proud of. I attended a conference in Lafayette last month. Very impressed with the group and the conversation. I was in the workforce development panel discussion. What is the biggest obstacle that employers identify as for new hires to be work ready? What's the biggest obstacle? Work ethic. Work ethic. Do I really want to work hard enough, right, once I get the job? Everything's about instant gratification. Ever since I've been on this board, I keep asking, where's the sense of urgency? Where's the sense of urgency? Why are we doing this? Why are we doing that? Why are we doing the other? Well, now we're here to sense of urgency to get these kids through school, but I question whether or not they're qualified or they're prepared to successfully compete in life. Now that's a sense of urgency. I just struggle with that. Well, why is urgency a big deal now? Now you want to push them out the door and they're not prepared. I don't think that's our job. So I would just ask the board to consider that it is all about kids, right? But I think it's about doing what we need to do to set standards that kids recognize in life. Their standards. You know, you got to meet the standard, or you don't compete. It closes the door. And we've set standards in the state, and some kids aren't going to get there, like Dr. Beauchet, Superintendent Beauchet said, 4% aren't going to get there, right? We're talking about 1,000 students here. So the question is there something we can do here for those 1,000 students to better prepare them and to appreciate expectations in life? These are the expectations. You meet or exceed the expectations, you move on. You don't move on. That's an important life lesson. If they learn that lesson now, that's a great lesson. So when I talk about what's fair, what's unfair, where's the equity, where's the inequity, if you let students go through this whole 4-year high school experience and they don't feel like they earned it, somebody gave it to me, they're not prepared, then they're going to go out and compete somewhere, and then there is going to be inequity. Because I'm not qualified, and I can't compete with the next guy who is prepared. And therefore, there's inequity. But the kid leaves high school and he is prepared, right? Then there is equity because they can compete. And to me, that's a consideration here is that we feel good as a board that we've done everything we can to prepare these kids for life, for success, and not all of a sudden now have some sense of urgency to get them out the door, because we are leaving them with options. It's not like we're not leaving them with any options. We've heard several options here that are available. You can still get your high school diploma, but you have to earn it. So, thank you, Mr. President. Okay, Mr. Rock.
I support the motion, Mr. President. I think these kids have been through for the last 3 years extraordinary for all of us, and I don't see it as pushing them out the door. I'll give an exception, so if I can hold, I call for the question.
Does anyone have an objection to calling the question and voting on the motion? Hearing none, let's vote on the motion. I think we need a roll call vote, please.
Dr. Bopey?
Yes.
Mr. Castillo?
Yes.
Dr. Davis?
Yes.
Ms. Ellis is not in attendance. Mr. Mellering is not in attendance. Mr. Morris?
No.
Ms. Orange Jones is not in attendance. Mr. Rock?
Yes.
Ms. Bochet?
Yes.
Ms. Holloway?
No.
And Mr. Garvey?
No.
Motion failed.
Okay, designated members, we have one more item on the agenda. How many speaking cards do we have in on that item?
None.
None. Do y'all wish to take this item or break for lunch and come back? That's correct. Just thinking. Okay, next item, please.
Next item, consideration of a waiver request for Terrebonne Parish School District for the 21-22 school year regarding policy contained in Bulletin 741, Louisiana Handbook for School Administrators, as it relates to graduation requirements. The recommendation is to approve.
We get a motion. Ms. Holloway, we need a second.
I'd like to make a substitute motion.
Yes, Ms. Bochet?
I'd like to entertain this waiver for all school systems impacted by the Hurricane Ida issue, which would include the emergency, all the members of declared emergency under Hurricane Ida.
Okay, another question for the department. Can you identify which parishes that would include?
Just to make sure I understand what you're.
Not if you can list the names, but will you be able to identify them later?
It depends.
By that description?
It depends. Are we talking about the FEMA list where they have like individual assistance and public assistance?
That the governor declared the emergency in whatever those parishes are.
Yeah, the proclamation will indicate the
I don't
districts.
know how many there were exactly.
To the governor's proclamation, not the federal classification.
Yeah,
I understand the
I
motion.
understand that. I don't know what those.
But you can identify them. Great. Do we have any discussion from desk members on this? No. Okay, I think we need a roll call vote on this one too. Do we have any, we don't have any cards.
Mr. Phil Martin, would you like to?
Kane asked me to be brief, so no, I think you guys had some good answers.
Okay, Mr. Superintendent?
I was just gonna share the reason for the recommendation on Terrebonne. I have received a letter, an informal letter from some leaders earlier in the year with reference to the conversation. It wasn't a formal letter, but it was to consider waivers. At that point, I had conversations with leadership of the board. We made a decision that we were not going to move that forward. Last board meeting, there was a request for a waiver from LaFouche for this issue. I had a recommendation to deny that waiver. The board took the position, and I understand the position, to approve that particular waiver. And so when I received a request from Terrebonne, it was hard for me to differentiate between Terrebonne and LaFouche, with them being sister communities, both platooning, and both having significant impact. So that is why this recommendation for me has to approve, as opposed to last month, I had to deny for LaFouche, because once the board took action to approve, I couldn't differentiate between Terrebonne and LaFouche and their circumstances. So I just want to make that available to the board.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any other questions or comments from board members? Hearing none, and we do have nurse teachers, is that correct, Ms. Holloway? Okay. Roll call vote, please.
Dr. Bovee? Yes. Mr. Castillo?
Yes.
Dr. Davis?
Yes.
Ms. Ellis is not in attendance. Ms. Holloway?
Yes.
Mr. Mellory is not in attendance. Mr. Morris?
Yes.
Ms. Orange Jones is not in attendance. Mr. Rock?
Yes.
Ms. Bochet?
Would you like to vote?
Oh, no, I'll catch.
The motion passes.
Okay, next item.
That concludes your agenda.
Thank you.